Hi everyone, good evening and thank you so much for joining in on day 3 of India's largest virtual celebration of science. India Science Festival is very excited to welcome all of you to IISER 2022, which is the third edition of our massive science festival. On behalf of the entire team at the Foundation for Advancing Science and Technology, I welcome you all. My name is Shruti Sundaresan and I'm working as the program coordinator at India Science Fest. I have with me on the back end Shubh and Parth, who are working as the ISF moderators and will be presenting all of the action live to you on Twitter and Instagram. So make sure to go over there and follow us for live updates. I will just very quickly run all our attendees through a quick presentation so that we're all aware of what the festival is offering us for the next 15 days. And of course, then we'll start off with our first event for today. So Parth or Shubh, if you could just quickly tell me if you can see my screen.
Yep, visible.
Great. So like I mentioned, India Science Festival is running from the 8th to the 23rd of January, and the festival is themed around continuum. We're looking at where we've come from and where we're headed. The festival features a variety of talks, panel discussions, workshops, demonstrations, competitions, and games. And it's an excellent opportunity for everybody to come together, participate, network, learn, share, analyze, compete, and at the end of the day, celebrate science. ISF is the flagship event under the SciComm vertical of FAST India, and we aim to celebrate science and connect young people and general members of the public with scientists, researchers, public engagement practitioners, innovators, and industry professionals. We have a variety of events lined up for everyone at the festival. We like to believe that science is for everyone and there's something to do for everybody at this festival. Our talks, fireside chats, and panel discussions cover a variety of themes, such as the ones that you can see on your screen. This, of course, is a very small snapshot of the kind of events that we have lined up for all of you. You can check in your chat. We are dropping our website link, and you can head over to our website to know all about our events. We have so many contests and competitions for everyone at this festival, from a photography contest to a meme making contest, jam, drawing competitions, quiz contest. Do make sure to participate. There are exciting prizes for everybody. So head over to our website and register for all of these. This year, we have a variety of book talks. This is something really exciting at the festival. We have some wonderful books and writers who are going to be talking about the process of writing these science books, from neuroscience to research to inclusivity in science, from talking about deep tech to India's adventures in space, from looking at the science of science, all the way to discovering the science of Indian cooking. The book talks are really exciting, so make sure to head over to the website and look them up. We have some very exciting hands-on workshop for everybody at the festival. So we have one session on navigating careers in science, one on fact-checking, science improv, science policy, science writing, networking. All of these absolutely free. So make sure that you register for all of them and do tell your friends and colleagues to join us at the festival. We also have a lot of exciting events for kids, right from building a brain with clay to seeing very exciting photographs and paintings of the brain, playing online games, cracking puzzles and codes. All of these events are absolutely free to attend online, and we'll make sure that kids are engaged and are learning through some very exciting mediums. So do tell the children in your families to come and participate in the festival. The festival is going really global. We have speakers and attendees joining us from all across the planet. There has been so many attendees that have joined us from outside of India, and we're very glad to be able to host speakers and professionals from all across the globe. And of course, it goes without saying that this festival would not have happened without the support of our program partners, our digital media partners, our knowledge partners, and our outreach partners. I'll just quickly go into the housekeeping rules for our webinars. Please do drop in questions through the course of the talks or the fireside chats or the panel discussions in the Q&A tab, and we'll try our best to cover them during the end of the session. Absolutely no profanity will be tolerated in the webinar room. We reserve the rights to remove attendees from this session. And of course, all webinars will be recorded and you can find them on our YouTube channel, and the link is going to be dropped in your chat right now. Follow us and participate in all of our social media contests. So if there's something that you like about our events, take a screen grab, take a screenshot, head over to Twitter, tag us, and tell us what you liked about our events. Use the hashtag ISF2022, tell us what you really liked, and we'll make sure that the best tweets get exciting prizes. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to invite to stage our esteemed guest for this session, Professor Vikram Patel. Professor Patel, thank you so much for joining in. It's an absolute pleasure to be hosting you at India Science Festival. This session is going to be a very, very important one because Professor Patel is going to be talking to us about a very important and pertinent topic. Professor Patel is the Pershing Square Professor of Global Health at Harvard Medical School, and his work has focused on the burden of mental health problems across life courses, their association with social disadvantages, and the use of community resources for their prevention and treatment. He's the co-founder of the Movement for Global Mental Health, the Center for Global Mental Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, the Mental Health Innovations Network, and Sangat, an Indian NGO which won the WHO Public Health Champion of India Prize. Sangat has been doing some amazing work in the space of mental health, and we'll make sure to drop in the link of Sangat's website and their social media handles so that you all can go and check out the work that Sangat is doing. Before Professor Patel begins with his talk, I'm just very quickly going to launch a poll on all of your screens so that you can tell me a little bit about what you think of mental health. There are two questions on your screens right now. Maybe just if you could quickly tell us what you think of the same, do put in your answers, and we'll flash the poll results at the end of this, at the end of 2 minutes. Almost 70% of our attendees have given us answers. We just wait for 10 more seconds for more answers to come in, and then we'll show everybody the results of the poll. All right, let's share the results. So 97% of our attendees do believe that mental health is as important as our physical health, which is such a wonderful sign. 1% believes that mental health is not as important as physical health, and 2% of our attendees think that maybe mental health is as important as physical health. The second question is, did you start paying more attention to your mental health during the pandemic? And 66% of our attendees have said yes, whereas 34% of our attendees have said no, I took care of my mental health even before the pandemic. Some very insightful answers over there. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now. And with that, Professor Patel, over to you.
Well, thank you so very much, and what a fascinating poll that was. I'm not surprised that there's such a nice turnout for my talk today. Obviously, most of you already are, believe that what I'm about to speak to you about today is of great importance, just as important as your physical health, which of course I think goes without saying is an obviously very important asset to all of us. But what I really want to talk to you today about is my journey in a career in science that has sought to really demystify mental health, to democratize mental health, to make mental health not only something that any and everyone in the community can understand, but more importantly, something that anyone can actually do something about to help others in the community. But first, let me just tell you what I'm going to take you through in the next half an hour. I'm going to talk about the challenge very briefly about mental health problems, the opportunity that global mental health, the science that I'm most deeply associated with, has generated over the last decade, and what the future would look like applying that science to reimagine the mental health care systems of India and indeed all countries around the world. The challenge is huge. This particular chart comes from the Global Burden of Disease study. This is a study that looks at the burden of all health conditions, over 300, and looks at the relative proportion of the overall burden of disease. Imagine the overall burden is a pie chart of 100%, for example, and you're looking at the percentage of different health conditions accounting for that overall burden of disease. And what you can see here is that between 1991 and 2016, over a 25-year period, no matter what country you're in, the countries are organized according to their development status. The poorest or the least developed countries are in this light blue line, and the wealthiest countries on the red line. What you can first of all see is that in all countries of the world, the relative burden of disease that is accounted for by mental health problems has risen 50% in the last 25 years. And what you can also see is that as countries become more developed, as they move from less developed to more developed, the relative burden increases. And that is really because of a number of factors, one of which is the failure, the success in richer countries controlling many other health conditions that are still very common in developing countries. For example, many infectious diseases, maternal and child health conditions, and so on. So as it were, the space on the pie chart for mental health problems expands, and so the relative burden increases. Put another way, as countries become more developed, unless you do something about mental health problems, the burden of mental health problems as a relative share of the overall burden of disease will keep increasing. Another very important fact about mental health problems is that they are health problems that hit the young. I would assume this is a large portion of my audience today, young adults between the ages of around 15 to 30. And what you can see on this slide, again, coming from the global burden of disease, that during this phase of life is when you see the biggest hump of the relative burden of mental and substance use conditions and self-harm. Let me see if I can remove this. Sorry, I'm just trying to remove this irritating Zoom window that is showing up, which I can't actually seem to do. So let me just put it here. So what you can see here is that between the ages of around 10 to 30, if you add up the blue bars, which is mental and substance use disorders, and the gray bars, which is self-harm, and let's just take this particular age group of 20 to 24, I suspect many of you are in this age group, and you add up the roughly 5% to the 17%, you'll see that about a quarter to a fifth of the entire burden of health problems in young adults is due to mental health problems. Now in India, the impact of this is pretty dramatic. The single leading cause of death in young Indians today and for the last 10 years has been suicide. And of course, suicide is the most extreme outcome of mental health problems. Now, unlike most other health conditions, if you consider, say, for example, cardiovascular disease, many kinds of cancer, and so on, you will find that thanks to investments in science and the application of those investments in the real world, that there has been a declining prevalence. For example, the prevalence of strokes, heart attacks, and mortality associated with these conditions has actually been falling in most parts of the world. Not so for mental illness. This is a slide that comes from the US. And what it shows is that regardless of how much money and resources spent on mental health problems, the US has more resources than any other country in the world. In fact, it has 1,000 times more resources than India. There are more Indians who were trained in psychiatry who are working in the US today than in India itself. Just to give you a sense of what inequity there is in the distribution of specialized mental health resources. In spite of the enormous amount of money the US spends on mental health care, there is virtually no impact on the prevalence, how common a mental illness is. And again, here you can see these lines according to age bands. The overall is in green. But what I want you to see here is a very interesting and worrying trend that when it comes to young adults, the prevalence has risen from about 18% to now nearly 22%, which is a very significant increase in the prevalence of mental health problems in this period. Indeed, in the US and also in India, suicide rates have been rising. In young Americans, suicide mortality has increased 50% in the last 10 years. In India, the data are much more recent, but there is an uptick, and you see similar rising trends in young adults in many, many countries around the world, which is something we should be very worried about. And of course, this is even before the pandemic. The pandemic will have made things a lot worse. This study that comes again from the Global Burden of Disease group, which was published in The Lancet just a few weeks ago, I've highlighted the main findings of the study. What it says is that the locations hit hardest by the pandemic, measured by decreased human mobility and daily COVID infection rates. Think about the first lockdown in India, the harshest lockdown anywhere in the world, which completely paralyzed human mobility. And think about the second wave that happened in India during April last year, where the latest data from a paper published in Science last week suggests that the true death toll was 6 to 7 times higher than the official death toll, making it the highest death toll in the world. So India has been hit hardest by both of these factors, that these were the factors associated with the greatest increases in the prevalence of depression and anxiety. And these authors estimated an additional 50 million global cases of depression completely attributable to the COVID pandemic. I want to end this challenges part of my talk with a very sobering reminder from Tom Insel, the neuroscientist, a dear friend of mine, who is the former head of the National Institutes for Mental Health, the world's largest funding body for neuroscience and all the related clinical sciences to do with mental health. His words speak for themselves. It turns out that unlike any other research investment in any other area of medicine or public health, no amount of money, $20 billion during his tenure, has produced an impact on the metrics that count the most: suicide mortality, the burden of mental illness as measured through the DALIs that I showed you earlier, or more social indicators, for example, the people with serious mental illness who are either living on the streets or homeless, who are incarcerated in prison. Now, one has to really, before one thinks of the solution, is to really ask this very important question: why have all countries failed to address mental health needs equitably? In no other area of health would you see such a gigantic failure across all nations of the world, regardless of the money they have. You know, it's not uncommon for us to say, yeah, India doesn't do so well when it comes to maternal and child health because we don't have enough doctors and nurses. And, you know, that is a reasonable explanation, because if you look at maternal and child health outcomes in the US or Europe, you'll find that they're doing extremely well, very low rates of maternal and newborn mortality, but not for mental health problems, as we've just seen. So there's something fundamentally problematic in the approach that the world has been taking to address mental health needs. And these are, in my view, the singular most important challenges. The first is a narrow binary biomedical framing of mental health into disorders. That is a problem that is fundamental. Whereas this use of diagnostic framings works very well for infectious diseases like TB and COVID, it does not work for mental health problems, which are in their very nature dimensional properties of every human experience. Dividing a dimension artificially in a binary way essentially misses the fact that at every point in our life, each and every one of us is somewhere on a spectrum from good to poor mental health, and that mental health itself comprises a number of different dimensions that do not map onto the diagnostic categories. There's a lack of attention in our programs of care and prevention to the social environmental determinants that have been shown repeatedly to influence brain development and ultimately the experience of mental health and recovery from mental health problems. There's a lack of a life course approach, even though, as I showed you earlier, something that we've known for decades, that mental health problems are predominantly problems of young people, that they have their onset before the age of 24, unlike cancer or heart disease, which have their onset after the age of 35. Mental health problems are young people's problems, which means that they start in youth. And that means that there's something happening in the first 15 to 20 years of life that we must act upon if we are to stop the onset of mental health problems. But unfortunately, if you look at how mental health programs are organized, they're all about treating problems way after the horse has bolted, way after mental health problems emerge in childhood and adolescence. There's a lack of skilled providers. This is, of course, true of all health areas in India. This is not only true of mental health. We have a lack of skilled providers, particularly if you see the issue of skills narrowly through the lens of degrees and professional qualifications like MBBS or MDs. If you look at it only through that lens, we are short of skilled providers. There's also the problem that there's a reluctance in the general population to seek help from psychiatrists and psychologists because of the enormous stigma, but also because of the enormous cost attached to seeing these highly qualified professionals. And of course, the enormous barriers of access. In very many parts of the country, there are simply no mental health professionals at all that you can access, even if you have the money. And then, of course, there's the disempowerment of available resources. And this is a problem that Indian innovators have experienced in the health sector for decades, ever since independence. And I think that this is the environment in which some of the most creative and innovative, impactful ideas have emerged. An environment of scarcity of a resource has compelled scientists to begin to collaborate with communities to identify how can we address the lack of specialized resources in the health sector by empowering the resources that exist in every community. When I returned to India after my training in Britain in the mid-1990s, I was deeply inspired by this book. People's Health in People's Hands was actually published well before the mid-90s, edited as a collection of essays by Dr. Antia, one of the great, one of the iconic leaders in the marriage of medical science with community participatory action, who, as a plastic surgeon, didn't do cosmetic surgery for wealthy people, but instead worked with communities on how one could reintegrate people who had horrible deformities due to leprosy back into their communities through a combination of medical science in the form of reconstructive surgeries, as well as reintegration and rehabilitation of people into their communities. It's in reading this book, there were many, many different inspirational examples, but it's reading this book that I came across one inspirational example that has really been at the heart of a lot of the work that I've been doing. And that inspirational example was of this woman, Anjana Bai, that you can see here being trained really on how to weigh a baby. This is a woman who works in Gadchiroli, one of the poorest tribal districts of India, bang in the middle of the country, in the eastern edges of the state of Maharashtra. This is the kind of woman who was trained by Abhay and Rani Bang, two physicians who trained in India, went to Johns Hopkins to do their masters in public health, and returned and set up shop in this poorest of districts of the country, and discovered that there were no neonatal experts, no gynecologists, no obstetricians who could help work on reducing the astronomically high mortality rates that mothers and newborns were facing during childbirth and due to infections soon after childbirth. So what do? They turn to working with the community to identify helpers in the community, such as Anjana Bai, who could be trained in basic principles of evidence-based medicine to save newborn lives. That included skills on how to weigh babies, how to assess fever and diagnose infections and deliver in medical treatments, such as, for example, injectable antibiotics for babies who they had diagnosed had sepsis. Remember, these are women who had not even completed high school, let alone actually gone to a college. Of course, as you can imagine, when Abhay and Rani began pioneering this work way back in the 80s and 90s, there were howls of protest from the medical lobby. It said, my goodness, this was terrible. This was so dangerous. And of course, they argued and said, well, excuse me, but there aren't any doctors in this part of the country. What do you want us to be doing? Watching mothers and babies die of conditions that were completely treatable? Isn't it ethically sound for us to train, at least train who we can to provide those life-saving treatments? And they said, well, the medical lobby said, well, prove that this is safe and effective. And that's exactly what they did. They went on to conduct what is often considered one of the most impactful randomized controlled trials in the history of medicine in India, that was published in the Lancet Medical Journal, the world's leading medical journal, demonstrating that this home-based approach of community workers or helpers diagnosing and treating newborn infections dramatically reduced neonatal mortality. A remarkable example of how medicine met community participatory action, met the highest quality of science, ultimately leading to such an impactful publication that led to this model being replicated in a number of sites in India and in other countries. And ultimately, this particular approach was embraced by the government of India in these operational guidelines you can see here, and ultimately the rolling out of the largest community health worker program in the world, the ASHAs, numbering more than 1 million, who have collectively contributed to the dramatic reduction in infant mortality in India and maternal mortality. Mind you, the maternal and infant mortality in India that has fallen in the last 20 years is almost 90% due to this intervention of home-based care and support by the ASHAs to mobilize mothers to have their babies in hospital. It is not because of very specialized interventions, it's because of this very basic community delivered intervention. Back in the early 2000s, when I was struggling to figure out how we could address the large unmet needs for care for mental health problems in India, I was deeply influenced by this work. I visited Gadchiroli. I read all about the work that Rani Abhay and many others were doing in other areas of medicine. And I wrote this manual, really inspired by their work. At that time, there was no real randomized controlled trial, no real evidence that in fact, such an approach was safe and effective. Even then, my book found many takers across the world. These are just some examples of the dozens of translations. The book also became the standard manual for the International Red Cross and MSF for their frontline workers in humanitarian contexts. But I was not happy with just simply writing a manual that was advocating and supporting the training of frontline workers to deliver mental health care without there being a robust scientific justification for it, evidence for it in the same kind of way that Rani and Abhay Bang had generated for newborn care. And that took me to a tremendous opportunity. And that opportunity was the rising field of global health. And within that field, I was one of the leaders in developing the mental health subdiscipline of global health. As you can see from this definition of global health, into which I've inserted the mental health pieces, this is an area of study, research, and practice. It's not just research in an isolated silo, but research that combines implementation and real-world delivery, that places a priority not just on improving a health outcome, but very importantly, achieving equity or justice in how that health is experienced and resources for those health problems accessed by all people in every country. In 2007, in the same journal, The Lancet, I led a series of articles that laid the foundation for the field of global mental health, 6 articles documenting the state of mental health care and unmet needs of care around the world, and ending with a call to action to scale up the coverage of services for mental health problems in all countries, but especially in low-income populations in those countries. And of course, that was most of India. And we called for the scale up to be based on 2 principles, that there had to be a solid scientific foundation on the evidence of what interventions were being scaled up, that these were interventions that must be shown to work in randomized controlled trials. And we had to twin that with a respect for the human rights of people with mental disorders, because we knew that the human rights of individuals with mental health problems, particularly serious mental health problems, were being gravely abused in all kinds of sectors of society, not least in hospitals of mental health care, where extreme forms of human rights abuse and violence were being experienced by people with mental illness. A few years later, Tom Insel, the head of NIMH, invited me to co-chair the Grand Challenges in Global Mental Health, a research priority setting exercise launched by the National Institute for Mental Health. The Grand Challenges in Global Health are an initiative that were launched actually by the Gates Foundation to identify the leading research priorities, which if funded, could actually shift the needle on a particular health problem. The original grand challenges focused on maternal and child health, infectious diseases, and non-communicable diseases. This third edition of the grand challenges focused on brain conditions, mental, neurological, and substance use conditions. We identified a large panel of experts, 400, involving a range of different disciplines: neuroscience, clinical practitioners, people with a lived experience, researchers, and policymakers, and asked them what the leading research questions were that, from their point of view, that if invested in now, could lead to a dramatic reduction in the burden of mental health problems. We published our findings, a set of research priorities, in the journal Nature. And perhaps not surprising now, that the leading research priorities were delivery questions, not questions about discovering a new gene, a new molecule, a new neural circuit, but about doing better with the research, with the knowledge we already had, by making that knowledge available to more people in every community, in every country of the world, what we call implementation science. 10 years later, I can tell you, with more than $1 billion of new money backing these grand challenges, that we know how to deliver clinical and preventive interventions in an affordable and acceptable way in any resource setting, such as this image here in Zimbabwe, where the woman on the right is a grandmother from the local community delivering a 6-session psychological treatment for people with depression, such as the woman on the left, who is a mother with depression, referred by a nurse in the primary health center at the back there to see this grandmother therapist. And what is this intervention called? The friendship bench, because it is delivered on this wooden bench that's been erected under a tree in the compound of the primary health center. I have worked over the last 15 years with the NGO Sangat in Goa, and we, as you can see from the titles of these many different articles published in leading journals like JAMA and Lancet and so on, have been working on designing interventions for the delivery by lay and community health providers for a wide range of mental health conditions, from autism in childhood to adolescent mental health problems in schools, to schizophrenia, depression, and drinking problems, all the way through to supporting older adults with chronic diseases. And in the next slide, in a video, I want to show you really a snapshot of what this intervention looks like and is experienced by people in the real world for a program that we ran for people with schizophrenia, one of the most severe chronic mental health conditions. This was a trial we ran in 3 sites in India, in Satara, in Maharashtra, in Goa, and in rural parts of Tamil Nadu. And the video will speak for itself.
So एकदमच मला कम से कम एक 5 मिनिटं आवाज माझ्या कानाला फिरत होता. मी देव बोलतोय असं तसं.
मानसिक आजार हे काय असतं हे मला याच्याबद्दल काहीच माहिती नव्हतं. म्हणजे हा प्रकारच माहित नाही. मला काहीतरी म्हणजे समायोजित वर्तनात काहीतरी आहे असं मला सारखं वाटायचं. पण कोणापुढे बोलायचं हा एक माझ्या मनामध्ये कुचंबणा व्हायचं.
आजूबाजूची लोक ते दृष्टिकोनातून बघायचे, तिच्या येडीचे हसती बघा कशी. कोण माणूस पुढनं येणारा असला तरी त्याला असं वाटायचं ती माझ्याकडेच बघत हसली, म्हणून तो माणूस असा बघत उभा राहायचा. मग मी ती उभी राहायचे. मी 2-3 माणसांना बडावलेलं बी आहे त्याच्यातनं.
वाईट वाटायला लागलं की झाडाला धरायचं आणि रडायचं. कुणाला सांगायचं नाही पण काय असं आहे म्हणून.
तसं तर देव वगैरे केले, लाख भांगे ले केल्या बरं का. देवाला ह्या देवाला जा, त्या देवाला जा, त्या अमक्याला पळा, कुणीकडे पळा, लांब लांब ले. जो 5-6 महिने आम्ही राखवलं देवासाठी. प्रमाण उलट देवाला वगैरे जास्तीच वाढायचं, पण कमी नाही.
कॉप्सी हा प्रकल्प जो आहे तो त्याचा लॉंग फॉर्म असा आहे, केअर ऑफ पीपल्स सिझोफ्रेनिया इन इंडिया. म्हणजे औषध उपचाराव्यतिरिक्त जर काही सामाजिक उपचार पद्धती जर या लोकांना चालू केली.
डॉक्टर आणि पेशंटच्या मधला दुवा असा आमचा रोल होता.
ते म्हणलं पाठवा की सर, बरोबर. कारण आम्हाला माहिती येते कसं कसं काय गोळ्या द्यायच्या, कसं काय करायचं किंवा काय करायचे, कसं त्याच्याशी वागायचं, कसं काय, हे म्हणलं आम्हाला माहिती पडेल.
हे तुम्ही जे प्रोग्राम हे ठेवलं होतं ना, हां, तर त्याचा पुरेपूर फायदा आम्हाला झालाय. म्हणजे औषधांचं तर झालंयच, पण औषधांपेक्षा पण ते जास्त म्हणजे संभाषणाने ह्यांच्याशी व्हायचं ना, बोलायच्या.
जोपर्यंत जमेल ना तोपर्यंत तरी काम असावं आपल्याला असं वाटतं. जोपर्यंत जमेल तोपर्यंत. दिवसभर म्हणजे काही विचार वगैरे काही येत नाही. दिवसभर याच्यात मन रमतं ना.
आता जरा बरं आहे, आधीपेक्षा बरं आहे. म्हणजे कामाला पण जाते त्यामुळं शाळेचा खर्च आधी नव्हता, पण आता खर्च आलाय ती मम्मी भागवते.
Work is not just for money, it is for self-esteem. It's what you think about yourself. It's the way you spend your time. It's your productivity. It's what you give to society, what you get from society. So when they start working, then they feel much better. People learn to respect them. They start liking themselves.
आत्ताची परिस्थिती आणि त्या टायमाच्या परिस्थितीमध्ये किती आसमानचा फरक. म्हणजे माझं कारण म्हणतंय की इथून पुढं जे तुम्ही चितलेलं काम आहे, म्हणजे जे माइंडमध्ये तुम्ही ठरवलेलं आहे, पुढं लय त्याचं चालना मिळणार नाही.
So I coined this acronym. Some of you may have seen my TED talk from a few years ago, which I actually coined this acronym for that TED talk. What are the ingredients that go into this kind of design process for making effective mental health interventions available in these rural, remote, far-flung communities that optimize acceptability and feasibility? And these are my acronym was Sundar. Of course, all of you speak Hindi or many of the North Indian languages will recognize that that's a play on the word Sundar. But these are the ingredients. We need to simplify the message, break down the complexity of these medical interventions into their component active ingredients. By unpacking that, you can then deliver these using affordable and available human resources where people are, rather than where the professionals are. And in this way, improve access to care in an affordable way. And you can then reallocate the few specialists this country has to perform more specialized tasks, such as referral tasks and training and supervision. This evidence has transformed mental health globally. 10 years ago, I would not have been able to tell you that the World Health Organization's Mental Health Action Plan or the World Bank's Disease Control Priorities Program, or indeed at the level of India's national mental health policy, would have said that the single most important priority to transform mental health care around the world is by actually promoting the building of skills in the community of non-specialist providers to deliver psychosocial interventions. Indeed, to my greatest surprise and pleasure, particularly now that I work at Harvard Medical School in the US, when last year the RAND Corporation released a very important landscaping analysis report on how to transform the US mental health system, look at what they recommended. A country that has 1,000 times more mental health resources than India was calling for taking a model that emerged in India by training non-specialists to deliver frontline mental health care, even in the US. And this tells you something very important, that it's not just about how much money you spend. It's not just about how many specialists you have. It's actually about completely reimagining who is a mental health provider, what mental health care do they provide, and where that care is provided. And importantly, it also shows the importance of the entire pathway of science. For much too long, much of the funding in the mental health sector has really focused on phase 0, 1, and 2 in this translational continuum, on basic science discovery of genes, of new molecules, of new neural circuits, and doing early clinical trials. But what we've shown now, that what finally makes a huge impact is if you make sure that you also invest in the later kinds of science further down the line, that is to say the science that is associated with taking basic lab discoveries and making them applicable to real human beings, and most importantly, ultimately, that can be adopted and implemented at scale. I want to close by really thinking about the work that I'm doing now, the future, what excites me, and how I'm taking this agenda forward in what I consider now the last phase of my own scientific career. A few years ago, the editor of The Lancet invited me to lead a major new commission for the journal on global mental health and sustainable development. Of course, the SDGs have become a very important framework for thinking about the place of science and medicine within the overall scope of sustainable development in all our communities. And we brought together all the evidence that I've briefly shared with you, but also many other kinds of evidence, for example, the revolution that digital technologies have afforded us, and came up with a set of recommendations for a reframed mental health system. Firstly, that we had to abandon altogether the very old diagnosis-focused system of mental health care, which focused on a diagnosis by a psychiatrist and often a prescription that followed, but recognize that we can intervene across an entire range of degrees of severity of different dimensions of mental health experiences. To do that, we also had to therefore emphasize prevention that targeted particularly the structural and social determinants in the early life course, particularly maltreatment and neglect in childhood and adolescence. For people with serious mental illness, we needed to have a rights-based approach to eliminate coercion and institutionalization in mental health care. And ultimately, the foundation of every mental health care system really had to be on the scaling up of psychosocial interventions using community-based providers such as community health workers, peer support specialists, and indeed just lay people. And so I want to end by telling you what I'm doing in order to make that a reality. 2 years ago at Harvard Medical School, in partnership with Sangat in India, we launched an initiative to actually achieve exactly that goal. The scaling up of psychosocial interventions through empowering ordinary people in the community, community health workers, nurses, midwives, peers, to learn, master, and deliver evidence-based psychological treatments using a suite of digital tools. So this was not a digital app for people with mental health problems to learn how to fix their own minds, but instead a digital platform to train frontline workers to deliver in-person care, which is what most of us actually want when we have a mental health problem, and to inform and empower the system with data to understand what impact that is having in their population. So this just shows you a kind of an infographic of the suite of digital tools and functionalities, from learning management systems, competency assessments, all done digitally, supervision and support to support the mastering of the psychological treatments, continuing quality assessments, decision support when a provider is faced with multiple different kinds of mental health problems and needs to know which clinical intervention to deliver. And at the level of the system, as large numbers of providers are providing care, a range of data science driven opportunities, for example, prediction models to refine treatment selection and evaluating impact at scale. So there's a combination of some pretty basic digital technologies here with some very sophisticated advanced data science, which actually can't be done at all if we continue doing business as usual. The seeds of Empower were laid 10 years ago when I developed and designed a 6-session treatment for depression called the Healthy Activity Program that was trialed in Goa first and replicated in a trial in Nepal, and now has been adopted by 3 centers in North America and adapted for maternal depression, making it the first time that a clinical intervention developed in India for lay health workers is now being used in North America. We designed this intervention. It's now also being used in many African contexts. And what we decided was what we needed to do was to now train frontline workers to deliver this intervention using an online curriculum. We've designed that curriculum. We've completed a randomized controlled trial demonstrating that coach-assisted digital learning was just as acceptable and effective as the gold standard of in-person learning. Why do we do digital learning? Well, primarily because to train the million ashas who we need to train to deliver this brief psychological treatment, we can't do it through a workshop model. It's simply never going to happen. The cost, the time needed, and also the disruption in the daily life of the asha is too huge. So this is a model of creating high quality training, because of course the training content remains exactly the same. There is nothing lost because the trainer has changed, and you can do it on your own time and do it in a rapidly scaled up way. So we're now scaling up this training through a complicated platform of both training as well as supervision and quality assurance in 3 districts of Madhya Pradesh. What's been really remarkable is ashas, most of whom have not passed the 12th standard, take to this training so well. 95% of them completed the training. The feedback we got was amazing. And importantly, their competencies were as good as those ashas who in a comparison group received the gold standard training. But what's really exciting is we're replicating the same work in the US. Last year, I won a $10 million prize along with colleagues in Texas, where we're taking exactly the same model, that we designed, developed, and implemented for the first time in India. We're taking it to Texas with support from a number of different partners, as well as this prize money over the next 4 years. This same brief psychological treatment for depression will be scaled up in the hands of community health workers and nurses in one of the wealthiest countries of the world. Ultimately, what we envisage and think of is a mental health care system where evidence-based psychological treatments can be delivered in the community through empowered providers, very many different kinds of providers who act as an outreach, a extension of the footprint of the mental health care system. In closing, we're going to need to do something about the rising demand of mental health problems. You already saw earlier that not only was the unmet need for care huge. By the way, I don't know if you're aware of this. The government's own statistics show that 95% of people in India with a mental health problem do not have access to mental health care. 95%. This is the government's own data from the National Mental Health Survey. And this was before the COVID pandemic. And you just saw that the COVID pandemic is going to massively increase demand. If we stick with the current system, which only help 5 to 10% of people, you can imagine the unmet needs for care are going to even further increase. We need a radical transformation by implementing the science that I've shared with you today if we are going to increase the number of people helped. In closing, this is a historic opportunity for us to invest in mental health care. COVID has shone the spotlight like never before on mental health. And while we certainly need more money, we also need to spend it wisely, guided by the best science. And that best science that I've shared with you today shows that mental health care must go beyond the narrow biomedical and embrace the diversity of experiences and strategies that science has shown work and can transform lives. Thank you very much. And I'm now going to turn it back to you, Shruti.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was absolutely lovely. And if I can just add to what you said, the video that you showed, that was absolutely moving. It was so lovely to hear from all of the speakers in that video. I mean, I could see that they really were speaking from the bottom of their heart. Their emotions were up on their sleeve. It was really lovely. And thank you so much for touching upon such pertinent topics. We have so many questions for you. I'm just going to quickly fire them up so that we can cover as many as possible. The first question that we have here is, if someone is facing a mental health issue, who are we supposed to approach? We're students, we might not be comfortable sharing it with parents, and we don't have enough money to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist. What's the first step to address mental health?
Well, I can tell you honestly that this has been a huge challenge. This is exactly my point that I made. The good news, I can tell you there is good news, and that's come out of the pandemic, is the tremendous adoption of teletherapy. So today you don't need to be near a therapist. You don't need to have any of the embarrassment of walking into a clinic that says therapy. You can access care online. And the other good news is a lot of that care is free. For those of you who would like to access care for free with very experienced mental health professionals, log into the Sangath website. There is a, thanks to COVID, Sangath has been able to mobilize resources to offer a free online teletherapy by highly qualified professionals. So I can tell you right away, that's the place to go where you can get care without leaving your home at all.
Thank you so much. If I could just request the moderators to drop in Sangath's website link in the chat, I think that would be very, very useful for all our attendees. The next question that we have here is, do you think as budding psychologists, we should now focus more on community psychology that focuses on prevention rather than cure? What advice would you give to budding psychologists?
You know, for me, psychology is one of the most exciting sciences. And, you know, to me, it is along with neuroscience, psychological science and neuroscience together. Psychological science is so diverse, from, you know, from cognitive neuroscience to the kind of science that I've just, you know, talked about, clinical sciences and its application. I don't think any one of those is more important than the other. I would like you to think of the entire translational spectrum from discovery to delivery as being important, and your place depends on where your heart is. Honestly, I think you've got to be driven by your passion. If we did not have the basic discoveries that laid the foundation for those psychological treatments, we would not have any treatment to deliver at scale. So I have enormous respect for those people who spend a lot of their time in animal labs, because some of the original behavioral experiments were done with animals that then led to translation into human subjects, that then led to translation into populations. And I work at the more population end, but I don't believe that any one of these is more important than the other. They're all equally important, but you don't have to do it all. You just have to go to that part in that translational continuum that makes you most excited.
And I mean, I think that's something that so many researchers on our platform have said, that if you are excited about the work that you do, you will produce good results. I was very thrilled to see the example of search at Gadchiroli that you quoted, because Professor Dr. Abhibhang was actually part of our festival last time. And he told us about the community health practices that he had adopted in his work at Gadchiroli. And I think that brings me to the next question. Do you think that while promoting the cause of mental health, there are some specific things that you have done that have worked for you? And is there some specific tool that you have used which has worked very well while talking about mental health to non-specialist audiences?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I would say the single most important thing is to demedicalize it. The moment you apply medical labels, which are filled with fear, with shame, with anxiety, you actually, first of all, you create more anxiety. And secondly, as I explained to you earlier, these medical diagnostic constructs that were invented, there was no scientific proof to them. They were invented for good reason back in the 70s, because there was felt that by having descriptions that involve the clustering of symptoms that were observed in the clinic, you would create patient groups that would then enable you to discover some core pathology. That never happened. And now we know that actually the most parsimonious, the most effective way to describe mental health problems is a series of dimensions. And there are very good dimensional systems that are out there. I won't go into details. So there's no scientific foundation in those labels. And more importantly, those labels are associated with enormous confusion in the mind and anxiety. So for example, rather than telling somebody you have this clinical condition called depression, I literally paraphrase, or we train the health workers to paraphrase and say, look, you're not sleeping well at night, you're getting these terrible thoughts about your future, and you're even thinking of harming yourself. This is because your son has just lost his job and you're worried about him. So you're connecting the etiology with the actual symptoms, and that immediately makes the person at ease and say, yeah, you heard me. You didn't just say, here's your illness diagnosis and give me a prescription. So I think humanizing and demedicalizing the experience of mental health problems has been the most powerful anti-stigma strategy that I have found in my work.
It's very well put. So humanizing and demedicalizing stays. So the next question that we have here is, can you tell us about your work with young people while working on mental health interventions, specifically with respect to the work done at Sangat? How have you involved young people to be involved in different mental health initiatives?
Yeah, well, that's been one of my most passionate areas of work. That's one of the first things I started back in the 90s. One of my first papers was called Sex Studies or Strife. What do young people really care about? And the point I was trying to make there was that the focus back in the mid 90s on young people's health was all about HIV prevention. And I wanted this enormously important subject of young people's well-being to go beyond just safe sex as being the single most important thing. Sex for pleasure, for example, the need for romantic relationships and how that related with people's well-being. This was being completely ignored at that time. And so that my interest in young people, a broader youth-centered and youth-led definition of well-being has always been one of my guiding principles. And right through my work, the way I've done that is by always having young people advising me in very formal roles, not just in a tokenistic, informal way. And most recently, over the last few years, I've had a group of young people in Sangat who are leading our youth engagement. So they themselves are young. Of course, over years, some of them become a little older. But when they started, they were all very young. And they run some amazing youth engagement programs with support from the India Alliance, for example, from the Wellcome Trust and others. including something called Manmela. You can maybe write that down in the in the chat box, www.manmela.org.in, which is a museum of the mind that is led by young people, that involves storytelling as a medium to destigmatize mental health problems, storytelling about one's mental health in very different Indian stories. And the stories are told through comic books, through poetry, a variety of different media. So, that's been one of the most enjoyable and rewarding parts. And it is through young people that I've come to the conclusion that a narrow medical approach will never, ever work. You can have psychiatrists and psychologists breathing down your neck, and yet it'll have no impact. It's not just a question of not having human resources. It's also a question of how you conceptualize this issue fundamentally.
One of my favorite things about speaking to scientists and researchers at the festival is how much importance they give to young people and don't dismiss them off, because young people seem to have the best ideas. They seem to be able to channelize thoughts a lot better than all of us. But so the next question that we have here is, do you think, what role do you think social media has played in mental health issues? And do you think that there is any way that we can really take time off from the screen time that we are forced to during the pandemic? How do we distinguish between the incessant amount of social media in our life and the kind of harm that it's causing?
So two things I want to say from the science. The first is that the effect of social media on the developing brain is very age dependent. When the brain is most plastic, which is in the first decade of life, obviously the impact of screen time will be completely different than when the brain is completely consolidated in its architecture in their 20s. And of course, the adolescent period, the youth period, is a kind of shoulder period between a highly plastic brain and a brain that is largely stable in its architecture. So as you grow older, the screen time effect is different. So there isn't a one size all fits answer to the issue of screen time according to how old you are. The second question is that in young people, which is a transitional phase of brain development, and during which most screen time actually is most intense, is when screen time really becomes greatly expanded. There's been very large population level studies examining longitudinally the association of screen time with mental health. And the net result of that is that there isn't a clear answer, basically saying there isn't a direct linear relationship, a unidirectional relationship between the amount or the type of screen time and mental health. It turns out that people using the same amount of screen time, equal proportion say it's harming their mental health, and equal proportion say it's actually improving their mental health. It turns out that what's more important are other things that are happening in the young person. For example, their pre-existing mental health and well-being, what is happening in their environment. For example, how are they engaging with peers in offline ways? Are they actually having offline relationships? What is the relationship like with their parents? How are they using social media? Are they using it for constructive things? For example, speaking to a grandfather who is, living somewhere far away to have conversations, etc. It isn't just a crude metric, how much social media do you use? It is likely to be an exquisite interaction at a very personal level between the person, the way and amount of social media they use, and their environment that actually helps us understand why for some social media is harmful, but for others, it can actually be very empowering.
So much, Professor. I think, time just really flew by. We have so many questions, but I think I can take one or two more. One of the questions that we have here is actually a very interesting one. How do we differentiate between having a mental health issue to being sad? How can we check on our own mental health on a regular basis? Are there any practices? Are there any patterns to identify that maybe we can keep in mind or share with our friends and family? And then we'll be able to acknowledge our mental health issues better.
So, that's a great example of a question that goes straight to my point about the binary. Just being sad is also important. You don't need to be having a disorder to acknowledge that you are in pain. Let me give you a good example. Supposing you're sitting around, supposing you stub your toe and it starts bleeding. Now you're not going to run to accident emergency for that. You're not going to go to orthopedic surgeons. Oh my God, my toe is bleeding. But you're not going to sit around doing nothing either. right? You are going to do something about that bleeding toe. You're going to take it home, you're going to wash it, you're going to put a bandage, and if it's paining a lot, you're going to speak to someone, someone close to you and say, look, can you get me a painkiller? That's what you got to do when you're feeling sad. You don't have to medicalize it. By having a dimensional approach, the whole point is you recognize that across the full spectrum of distress, at the extreme end of that spectrum, yes, these are clinically significant conditions with profound impairment that do need clinical interventions. But there are other forms of distress on that dimension that are equally difficult to live with, for which maybe you don't need a clinical intervention, but you can reach out to people immediately around you. The key step is acknowledgement, recognizing in the same way that you won't just sit watching your bleeding toe and say, oh, maybe it'll stop bleeding tomorrow. And you do something about it. When you're feeling sad, don't sit around waiting to think, oh, maybe it'll go away tomorrow. Say, no, let me just talk to my mom. Let me talk to my boyfriend. Let me talk to someone. Hey, look, I'm feeling really lousy right now. Because 99 times out of 100, that's all you need to do.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was so well put, and I'm so glad we were able to speak with you about such a pertinent issue. I would encourage all of our attendees to please look at all the resources that we've spoken about in this talk. There are so many links that we have dropped in the chat. Please do look them up. And Professor Patel, that has brought us to the end of this session. I'm just going to ask you one last question that we ask all of our speakers. You have been such an active proponent of bringing science to the masses and engaging in public engagement activities. How important do you think a platform like India Science Festival is to sort of bridge the gap between science and society? And what do you think these platforms, what is the role that they play in communicating credible science to masses?
I think they're profoundly important, Shruti. I mean, I'm so thrilled, first of all, to be given the privilege of speaking on this forum. For me, the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated the importance of good communication. I mean, if there's one thing the science community could learn is how do we communicate? We have been awful by and large. Let's be absolutely blunt. I can see Shahid who's joined. I don't know if Shahid will agree with me or not, but by and large, the science community has not been very good in communicating facts about the epidemic, whether it's about treatments or prevention or vaccines or whatever. And, it's easy to blame the public, but the public is also darn confused. Most people I know don't know who to believe anymore. So I do think that we don't get training in science, we don't get training in communication just because we're good scientists, we publish in great journals, and somehow people think you're magically therefore able to communicate. We now know that's not the case. We're not magically able to communicate. And I think therefore the ability to communicate should be integrated in every training of every scientist, particularly those sciences that are society facing, like for example, clinical science and public health science. Equally, an opportunity for us to be challenged and interrogated by the community. We don't have forums like this. How often do you have, for example, the people making the COVID decisions being actually on a town hall? We should have that. In the US, you have that. You have Tony Fauci in a town hall where ordinary people can fire questions at him and say, why did you say to not to use a mask at the beginning of the epidemic and now you do? What's changed your mind? And we should be in a position to be able to explain that, because of course, science is a constantly dynamic process. It isn't the case you can sit back in 2 years ago and say, oh, he said that then, but that was what we knew then. But you need to be able to explain that. And when you do that, you win the trust of our community. If there is a certain segment of our community does not believe scientists anymore, there is no question about that. And to look at the anti-vax movement purely that these are idiots who don't understand, they're deplorables, etc., is not a helpful way to look at anti-vaxxing. It has to also look at the way, how do we communicate science more effectively to the general community? And I think you guys are doing a terrific job in that way.
Thank you so much, Professor. It was an absolute pleasure hosting you at India Science Festival. We really, really hope that we're able to host you for the next edition, hopefully in an offline, on-ground setting in India. And it would be lovely for you to engage with all of our audience members on a closer interactive level. So thank you so much for your time. On behalf of the entire team at ISF, thank you. And it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor Patel. And with that, we move on to the second session of our of the third day of India Science Festival. We're very, very excited to welcome Dr. Shahid Jamil, who's joining us all the way from Oxford. Dr. Jamil is, of course, a very, very renowned virologist and the ex-CEO of Wellcome Trust DBT India Alliance. He's very, very well known for his research in the hepatitis E virus and is currently a fellow at the OCIS and Green Templeton College at the University of Oxford. Dr. Jamil has been very, very communicative during the entire COVID-19 pandemic, and we've seen him on so many news interviews, television chats, and so on. And of course, he's been actively also fighting misinformation on his end. Dr. Jamil, it is such a pleasure to host you at India Science Festival, and we're so glad that you were able to join us. Before you start with the talk, I would like to tell all of our attendees that we'll be taking questions toward the end of the session. So make sure that you drop your questions in the Q&A, and Dr. Jamil will take it up towards the end. And I'd like to very quickly launch a poll for all of our attendees to learn a little about what they think of viruses. So there are two questions that are going to show up on your screen right now. The first says, how quickly do you think viruses mutate and evolve? And the second question is, did you know anything about viruses before the COVID-19 pandemic? Every question is valid, and of course, please feel to truthfully give us your answers because they're all anonymous and we can't see what you have specifically put in. So we just wait for 1 minute for all of you to give in your answers, and thereafter I will launch the poll results on our screens. All right, I'm just going to end the poll and share the results on our screens. So 45% of our audience members think viruses mutate and evolve within seconds, 34% believe that they evolve within minutes, and 21% believe that viruses take many years to evolve and mutate. The second question, 93% of our audience members knew what a virus means before the COVID-19 pandemic, 6% got to know about viruses only during the pandemic, and of course 1% doesn't know anything about viruses, and that's perfectly fine because Dr. Jamil is here to answer all of our questions and more. Thank you so much for joining in, Dr. Jamil. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Shruti and Sarah and everyone else who's involved with the Science Festival. Vikram is a hard act to follow, but I'll try my best. So let me just share my screen and get on with it. And you'll have to excuse me a little. I have a very bad throat, so I might go into fits of coughing. Don't be scared. These viruses don't transmit online. So, okay. So I was asked to talk about the evolution of viruses. And what does it mean for future outbreaks? The two questions that you put out were interesting questions. Most people, I think, lost the fact in the first question that you were asking both about mutation and evolution. So think about that carefully, and maybe after I finish talking, if you still have questions, we'll look at it. Okay, so what I plan to do today is do a virology 101, and hopefully by the time I'm done, you will be an expert on viruses, at least in social media. We'll talk about COVID-19, the lows and highs, what we've seen, the future of COVID-19, and that's my view of the future of COVID-19. Somebody else's view may be different. I'll also say a little bit about what's coming next in terms of an epidemic, a pandemic, and how do we prepare for it. Okay, so in Virology 101, I'll really talk about what is a virus, what does a virus do, where do viruses come from, and how do viruses evolve. A virus is something very pretty, actually. What lies behind this beauty can be something very sinister. And it was almost 45 years back that Jean and Peter Medawar, biologists, gave this definition of a virus, that a virus is simply a piece of bad news wrapped up in a protein. And if you think about it, a virus is nothing more than a piece of nucleic acid, which is surrounded, protected by a coat of protein. So it's actually a package of genetic information, which is protected by a protein shell. The genome, as you know, any genome, whether it's our genome, the genome of a bacterium or a virus, carries the code for what we do, what we are. The protein in the virus simply protects this code. It protects the genome, and it does two things. First, well, of course, it protects, and then it also ensures that the genome is delivered to the right cell, right host, so that the virus can infect and make more viruses. But before I go any further, appreciate the beauty of this virus particle. And this, by the way, is a dengue virus particle. And the thing that you notice is that it's a very symmetrical particle. You can see elements of symmetry in it. Most viruses that are considered to be spherical are not actually spherical. They are what are known as icosahedrons. An icosahedron has 20 equilateral triangles arranged in a closed space. And an icosahedron is defined by 3 symmetry axes, which are labeled here. It's a 5-3-2 symmetry. What does it mean? It means that if you rotate the particle around this axis to an angle of 360 divided by 5, you'll get exactly the same symmetry. If you rotate against this axis by 180 degrees, you get exactly the same symmetry. You rotate across this axis by 120 degrees, you get exactly the same symmetry. So they are extremely symmetrical particles. And that is, again, something that's very beautiful about these structures. Now, what do viruses, let me see. Yeah, what do viruses actually do? Well, viruses do the same things that we do. We make more of ourselves. Viruses make more of themselves. That's the fundamental attribute of life. Reproduction is the most fundamental aspect of life. And viruses also make more viruses. But they are obligate parasites, which mean that they have to be within a living organism, within a living cell, to be able to make more viruses. That's why, you know, your high school textbook definition talks about viruses as being at the border of living and non-living. So when they are in a living system, they are alive, they can make more of themselves. When they're outside a living system, then they don't make more of themselves, and therefore they're non-living. Viruses can also be harmful to their hosts because they can infect and destroy cells. Also because they can sometimes immortalize or transform cells, and that leads to certain cancers. Several viruses are associated with the development of cancers. But the death of a host has no distinct advantage for a virus. It happens, and that usually happens when a virus and host have not come to an equilibrium, and the host suffers the onslaught of a new virus. But once this equilibrium is reached, then usually the virulence is reduced, the mortality is reduced, the severe disease is reduced. But it's not like this is a game plan for a virus. A virus has no brain. What virus has is evolution on its side. And if you think about it, you know, a 99.9% loss of a viral population is very normal. A 1% loss in human population is a catastrophe. That's called a pandemic. So viruses have numbers on their side, they have evolution on their side. We have our immune system on our side. And this is the evolutionary conflict that keeps going on. And finally, every living species has one or more viruses that infect it. So this makes viruses to be the most biodiverse on this planet. It is often asked, where do viruses come from? Well, there are two hypotheses about this. The first hypothesis is that viruses were really the early forms of life. They arose in the primordial RNA world. And when two critical genes, one a capsid gene that makes a protein that makes the covering, and the other is a replicase gene, an enzyme that can multiply the RNA. When they get together and get packaged together, that made a virus. The other hypothesis is that, the other hypothesis is that of an escape host gene hypothesis, which says that viruses actually escaped from host cells. When these capsid and replicase type of genes got together and escaped from a living cell, that became a virus. Well, right now the evidence is largely in support of the first hypothesis, but then these two hypotheses don't have to be mutually exclusive because we are now beginning to see very large viruses come out of oceans that don't look like your typical small viruses at all. And it's possible that they have originated in a way that's very different from what small viruses, especially the small RNA viruses, have come about. Okay. So the next question is, how do viruses evolve? And to understand that, you have to first understand about mutation and mutation rates. So mutation is something that happens at random. And if you look at different viral families, you have RNA viruses shown in red, you have DNA viruses shown in blue, and you have something called reverse transcriptase containing viruses that have an RNA genome but go through a DNA phase in their life cycle, shown in purple. And you will notice that the least mutation rate is there in DNA viruses. And higher than that is the mutation rate of RNA viruses, and finally the reverse transcription elements. Now, why is that? It's largely because the way these genomes multiply. The DNA viruses multiply mainly using DNA polymerases, DNA-dependent DNA polymerases, which have proofreading functions. They can go back and correct errors. Whereas the RNA viruses multiply using RNA-dependent RNA polymerases, which do not have proofreading function. They cannot go back and correct. And that's why errors accumulate much faster in those compared to the DNA viruses. And if you plot, for example, the mutation per site per replication against genome size, you will notice that as genome size increases, the rate of mutation goes down. Now, why is that? That is largely because you have more genomic space available. More genomic space means that you can add enzymes that have proofreading ability, and therefore you can go back and correct errors. But you will notice that there is a band. Below that band, there is a cost of fidelity. And there are insufficient beneficial mutations. Beyond that band, you have excessive mutations, and that makes a virus not viable. So it's not just that the host pays a price for virus mutation and evolution. The virus also pays a very heavy price for this. And it pays this price so that it can get away from the way the host is trying to control the virus and be able to still multiply. So this is why I said there is this evolutionary conflict that keeps happening. Recombination is something else that happens in viruses. So if you have, let's say, two parental genotypes, the red type and the blue type, and the simplest way to think about it is if there is a cell that has both of these in them, and a replicase is going along this, chugging along this, but is able to jump templates and copy another template, then what comes out is a progeny genotype, let's say, which is all red. And the benefit of this could be that it can create beneficial genotypes, as shown here, or it could purge some deleterious mutations, as shown here. So recombination also happens quite frequently among viruses. It's not just point mutations, but also recombinations happen. And all of this really leads to accumulation of good mutations and removal of deleterious mutations. Good mutations from a virus perspective, but not good mutations from a host perspective. But remember, that doesn't always mean that is going to be bad for the host. Sorry. There's also something called a transmission bottleneck. Now, let's say you have this population of viruses in a donor host. And that host could be an animal, it could be a plant, it could be a human. Now, when that population is transmitted to a host, to a recipient host, how the population looks in the recipient host depends upon the bottleneck the virus goes through. So if it goes through a very strict bottleneck, meaning only certain strains, certain mutants, certain variants can get transmitted, then you have a fairly homogeneous population in the recipient. But then if the bottleneck is quite loose, then the population you see in the recipient is much more diverse. So all these things are continuously happening in nature. And finally, to look at evolution of viruses, a virus and host often co-evolve. So the two examples I'm showing you is hepatinoviruses. Hepatinovirus is a small DNA virus which causes hepatitis. So the hepatitis B virus, for example. You have the human hepatitis B virus and you have the animal hepatitis viruses, and they usually co-evolve with their host. So when an animal speciates further, the virus in that animal diverges with the host. So on the other hand, if you have a rhabdovirus, for example, which has a lot of animal hosts and human hosts and insect vector hosts and bird hosts, and they cross-transmit between each other, then eventually what will happen is a far more diverse population here on the right than here on the left. So all these things, again, are constantly happening in nature. I talked about the virosphere. The virosphere is the entire viral population. And what you will see depends upon how you want to look at it. So if you were only going to address it by culturing the virus, you'll see a very small amount of it. If you, for example, developed consensus PCR primers and tried to amplify, you'll see a bit more. But if you did metagenomics, you'll discover much more. And that's the problem we have right now, because the viruses that we know to be infecting humans or animals or plants. We know very little about them because we have relied so far largely on virus culture methods and consensus PCR methods. Only in the last few years has metagenomics come into this space. And what we now realize is that we have discovered only possibly about 2% of what is out there. 98% remains to be discovered. Okay, so now you know more virology than most experts you'll find on social media. So let me go forward and talk about something else and talk about the future. But before you talk about the future, I want to go back and say that, life can really be understood backwards, better understood backwards. But then, of course, it has to be lived forwards. And as Gandhiji also said, that the future depends on what we do today. So are we doing enough to mitigate what will come tomorrow? So I will switch gears and talk about these things now. So let us look at past pandemics. And there have been many pandemics since the recorded history, and I'm not going to get into that because there are very, very good sources available for that. Let's focus on the bottom part, where we look at what happened in the last 100 years. In the last 100 years, in the 20th century, there were three large pandemics: Spanish flu, Asian flu, Hong Kong flu, all influenza pandemics. When the Spanish flu happened, we didn't know what a virus was. A virus was only a concept. Something that went through a filter was a virus. Nobody had seen a virus. Nobody had seen a virus because they're too small to be seen with the kind of magnification available at that time. The electron microscope was invented in the early 1930s. So the first virus to be seen was actually somewhere in the late 1930s. So we were flying completely blind. But when you come to the 20th century, to the 21st century, you see that we've already had in the first 2 decades, 2 pandemics, swine flu and COVID, and a couple of near misses like Zika and Ebola and so on. So does it appear as if things are speeding up as far as pandemics are concerned? It does appear to be so, but we'll come to that. Let us go back to COVID and see how COVID changed our world. This graph is very familiar to you. These are the waves of COVID across, globally. And till today, there are 311 million recorded cases and 5.5 million official deaths. Both of these are likely to be underestimates. A slew of papers that have come recently, including one in Science just last week, showed that India alone had somewhere around 3.5 to 4 million deaths, possibly around 4 million deaths by the time the Delta wave, the second wave, ended in India. Now, if you look at the top 4 countries in the world in terms of numbers of cases, US, India, UK, and Brazil, you will find that the pandemic has happened in waves. And I'm not going to go into details of this because all of you have seen this, all of you know this. India, we had the first wave peaking around mid-September 2020. Then we had the second wave, which peaked around May 2021. And the caseload is again going up now. But what has been common the world over is a lack of leadership and a lack of adherence to science. And of course, like Vikram was saying, poor communication for how to deal with the pandemic and how to explain this to people. India is already into its third wave, the Omicron wave. On 9th of January, we had 180,000 plus reported cases. That's the daily caseload. And I show here 2 models, the Sutra model, and this data for Sutra is a little old. It's 3rd of December, and it showed 3 scenarios. The worst case scenario was India would have the third wave peaking around the end of January with about 150,000 cases per day at peak. You see that we have already crossed that. The IISc ISI model, and this is yesterday's simulation, again showing three scenarios depending upon how many susceptible people are around. If it's 30%, 60%, or 100% susceptible people, we don't know how many susceptible people are there in India, considering that so much infection has happened, but then Omicron is also bypassing a lot of immunity raised by other variants as far as infection is concerned. So this is all about infection. So the IISc ISI model predicts that India may have anywhere between, let's say, 300,000 to almost 1 million cases per day by the time this peaks. But most likely the peak is going to go up sharply and come down sharply, as we have seen elsewhere. So the point really is that it's a time to be extremely careful. Every model, don't worry about the numbers, every model says that this is the time to be very, very careful. Okay, but COVID has not all been bad. Let's talk about the positives. There have been huge science and technology innovations during COVID, and genome sequencing is one of them. Almost 7 million genome sequences are available in public databases. We know how the virus came by, how the virus has evolved through this time. Omicron is right here. This is the one that's at the leading edge of this, and you can see that almost 30% of virus globally is now Omicron, and this is going to increase. The other innovation has been vaccines. Within just less than a year, multiple vaccines got licensed, started getting delivered to people. And if you look at the graph on the right, this is how long it took to make a vaccine. It used to take decades to make a vaccine. Look at any vaccine. Whereas COVID, it took less than a year to make a vaccine. What's also very pleasing is that within a year, almost 9.5 million doses have been delivered into people. And this is also a proud moment for India, because for a country of India's means, to deliver 1.5 million doses to its population is no mean achievement. Every sixth dose that has gone into somebody is an Indian, and that's something to be extremely proud of. Vaccines do work. Don't worry about what people tell you. You'll hear your neighbor saying, my friend got vaccinated but still got infected. Well, these vaccines are not made to protect from infection. They're made to protect from severe disease. And if you look at the data in UK, if you look at the data in US, everything is telling you that while people may get infected, they are getting protected from severe disease. And across the age spectrum, as you get older and older, the value of vaccine for you becomes more and more. So it's better to vaccinate vulnerable populations than to vaccinate younger populations from a public health perspective. Okay, what is the future of COVID? Well, firstly, understand the difference between the SARS-1 virus and the SARS-2 virus, or SARS and COVID. The difference is that the SARS-1 virus was spread only when people became symptomatic. The SARS-2 virus started spreading even before you became symptomatic. So that's the difference why SARS-1 was limited to about 8,000 infections. SARS-2 is millions of infections and counting. The second question that people often ask is, would we ever be able to eradicate, would we ever be able to eradicate COVID? And the answer is no. We can only eradicate those viruses that have no animal reservoirs. We have eradicated smallpox. We have almost eradicated polio. And both of these survive only in humans. They don't live in an animal host. The COVID virus, on the other hand, has several animal hosts. And therefore, if you think that you can eradicate this virus, that is daydreaming, that should not even be tried. Can we achieve local eradication? So understand the difference between a virus that has a single immunodominant epitope and a virus that has multiple immunodominant epitopes. If you have a single immunodominant epitope and that epitope mutates, you have immune escape. If you have multiple epitopes, and let's say a couple of them mutate, you still have other epitopes through which the virus can be neutralized. In the case of COVID, it does appear that the number of epitopes through which neutralization happens are limited. And therefore, small mutations are able to, the virus is able to escape immunity. Whereas, a virus like measles, for example, you get measles once, you have lifelong protection because it takes an awful lot of mutation for the measles virus to be able to escape immunity. And that also has a fitness cost on the virus. Okay. The way these viruses are adapting, the way these viruses are evolving, and these numbers, these OC3, OC43 and 229E are coronaviruses that are endemic in the population. And if you look at the different genes, if you look at, for example, the polymerase gene, for these viruses as well as the measles and flu viruses, you find that there's very little mutation, adaptive mutation. Whereas in the receptor binding domain of the surface protein, you find the most amount of adaptive mutation. And that is because this is the protein that's under selection pressure because of the host immune response. What about the immunity to seasonal coronaviruses? And there are two studies now out, which are very nice studies, which show that the average person gets infected by these seasonal coronaviruses roughly every 2.5 to 3 years. And if on the right side, it essentially says the same thing, that about 3.5 to 4 years, you can get reinfected by these viruses. SARS coronavirus 2, the COVID virus, is unlikely to be different from these coronaviruses. So what does it mean? It means that once it becomes endemic, you will get infected every so many years, but till it does that, we will require periodic boosters to, at least people who are vulnerable will require boosters to get away from severe disease. I'm running short on time, so let me not go through explaining this, simply to say that if you isolate the virus at different points, and then if you take sera from people at different points, it tells us that the neutralization of future viruses is decreased largely because of antigenic evolution of the spike protein, the receptor binding domain, the binding loops in the receptor binding domain. And therefore, it is advisable to also periodically update the COVID vaccines as we go along, till the virus becomes endemic. But this transition from the epidemic to an endemic situation also depends upon the age. If the virus is going to infect, if the age distribution shifts to younger populations, then the virus is going to become endemic very, very quickly, reaching an infection fatality rate of essentially negligible 0.001. However, if there is a scenario where the virus causes severe disease in children, like the MERS virus does, they're all coronaviruses, but the first SARS virus and the second SARS virus cause very little disease in children, whereas MERS does. If that happens, then it will take a very, very long time for the MERS virus to become endemic, while the SARS-1 and SARS-2 viruses will become endemic much faster. MERS will possibly never become endemic in the human population. So what's the take home? The take home is that the COVID virus is here to stay, and just focus on the orange boxes here. The virus will continue to circulate, but once people are protected from severe illness, it might only cause mild to moderate disease. What next? Well, if you go back a few years, there was this paper published which showed how zoonotic diseases will emerge across the globe. And the first thing you will notice is that South Asia, Southeast Asia and parts of Africa seem to be hotspots. Several years later, an assessment showed essentially the same thing. And the two world maps differ because the upper one is about what has actually been observed. The bottom one is a simulation based on low detection, low surveillance in some countries. And if that is corrected for, what will happen? And again, you see the same thing, what you see here, that South Asia, Southeast Asia seems to be a hotspot. Of course, there are developments that facilitate spread, like air travel and trade and urbanization, population increase and climate change. But there are also advances, mostly technology-based, that facilitate control. We have genomic sequencing, we have vaccine and drug development, we have diagnostics, we have global communication networks that worked so well during COVID. Now, when you start seeing what will emerge, it's important to see what are the virus species, what is the virus species richness and mammalian species richness. And if you consider that, then rodents and bats are the ones that are likely to give out the most viruses. And where would these viruses go? They will go to the most abundant species on Earth, which is us. So we have to be really constantly surveying viruses that will emerge in the future from rodents and bat populations. The global reach of viruses will also increase with climate change. And don't worry about the details on this map. It simply shows that the Aedes mosquito vector can be present at higher and higher latitudes as temperature goes up. And so essentially the take home is that under extreme global warming, if the temperature goes up by about 5 degrees centigrade, then 1 billion people could face their first exposure to several mosquito-borne diseases, not just viruses, but many mosquito-borne diseases by 2080. And that is a fairly terrifying scenario at this point. I'll tell you two other short stories. One is from the Siberian Peninsula, where a case of anthrax came up, which killed a young boy, but also led to the culling of 200,000 reindeer. And this happened because an anthrax infected reindeer emerged from the permafrost, which had thawed. And that caused an outbreak in that population, which had not seen anthrax in many, many years. The second is about people looking at glacial ice and looking at what is there in glacial ice. So when they retrieved samples that were about 15,000 years old, they discovered by metagenomic analysis that there were 33 viral populations found in that ice. And out of that, 28 belong to novel viral genera and families, viruses that we have not seen as humans. So the point is that climate change is going to be a major, major impact on the kind of diseases that will emerge. And finally, how do we prepare for it? Well, the way we prepare for it is to constantly do surveillance and discovery, to make sure we have the appropriate, we understand the appropriate biology, we have the reagents, we have the assays. We continue with vaccine design and preclinical development, and also manufacturing and clinical evaluation. And of course, technology has played a big role. One important development that has happened in the past year is this DeepMind simulation, the AlphaFold program, which is able to now predict protein structures from essentially nucleic acid sequence. And that's going to play a huge role in how vaccines are going to be designed in future. I'm not going to go into the details of this. There's this lovely review in Nature Immunology 2018. Remember, this was before COVID, where these people looked at emerging technologies and vaccine development. And I really would urge those of you who are interested to take a look at this. Something else that would be of value is something called Global Immunological Observatory, which constantly monitors what is infecting populations. A susceptible population can be measured by serology because of drop in antibodies. A resistant population can also be measured by serology based on rise in antibodies. Unfortunately, the infected population can only be observed through cases and deaths. So if we are able to do the serology, we may be better prepared to mitigate infections. And that's this movement which is taking shape globally. The second movement that is taking shape globally is something called the Global Virome Project, which plans to discover 500,000 new viruses and foster solutions for this. So imagine, even before a virus has emerged into a human or animal population, if you've already figured it out, and if you already have reagents against it, then you can very quickly develop tests, you can very quickly develop vaccines. The trouble is the cost of this project, which is estimated to about 5 billion. In the pre-pandemic era, this was a very big number. But now that by January 2021, the global loss in GDP was something like 22 trillion, and we are looking at close to 80 trillion 5-year GDP loss. The 5 billion appears to be fairly reasonable. Synthetic vaccinology, as I said, again, is coming up. And that is why I'm personally very excited about the RNA and DNA vaccines, because essentially these can be synthesized off machines, which will be like microwave-sized machines, microwave oven-sized machines sitting in a doctor's office, which can be programmed. So that is really where technology is going. That's where the future of vaccinology is heading. So on the left is virus families and the vaccines that are available for them. On the right are other viruses of concern. You don't have to read through it, but what I want to emphasize is that currently we are in a reaction mode. What we need to do is to go in a preparation mode, because the future holds for the future demands that we go into a preparation mode and not do things when a virus finally emerges into the population. Vaccine access and equity is also very important. The top map shows you how countries have vaccinated their populations. The darker the green, more vaccine, more percent vaccination has happened. And you see that parts of Africa are very poorly vaccinated. The bottom map shows you where vaccine manufacturing sites are located. And it becomes immediately clear that if you're not making a vaccine, you're not getting a vaccine. So it's very important from a future perspective for vaccine manufacturing to also be very distributed, so that this question of access and equity can be handled. Of course, all of you know about the Sustainable Development Goals. COVID has impacted every single SDG. And if there is one lesson to be learned, is that don't take these disease threats lightly, because it will impact the way you are used to living. So finally, in summary, I told you about viruses, mutations, and evolution. We talked about how pandemics have increased in frequency in the past, how COVID has changed our world, but how COVID also offers an opportunity. And we've seen plenty of innovation, plenty of opportunity, and how the COVID virus is moving towards endemicity, but gaps in vaccination continue to be a threat. I talked about climate change and how that aids in disease emergence, and how emerging disease threats will continue to affect social development. And really mitigation now has to move from a reaction mode to a preparation mode. And finally, there are new technologies available and new ways of thinking available. And the new ways of thinking also includes equity. So, without that, we will not be able to move forward. So let me stop there and answer questions if you may have any.
Thank you so much, Jamil. That was really, really interesting. And thank you for demystifying the science behind viruses. I think it was very important for our audiences. And with that, I think I will take the questions. We have more than 40 questions in the Q&A tab, so we'll try to take as many of them as possible. So the first question that we have here is, how did we manage to make vaccines in such a short span of time? Is it just the technology that we have at hand, or were there some other factors involved?
So this technology, the platforms were under development for years. And for example, the RNA vaccines, this platform was under development for cancer vaccines for almost a decade. The Oxford AstraZeneca chimp adenovirus platform, they had tried it for Ebola, they were trying it for MERS, so it was there and they repurposed it. Shruti, can you give me a minute to get some water? My throat is really scratchy.
Absolutely, please.
Yeah, just give me a minute.
Sure, of course. Meanwhile, I would like to tell all of our attendees that we have some very, very exciting contests and competitions. So we have a photo contest. So head over to our website, and the theme of the photo contest is called Science in Everyday Life. So you can actually take a picture of anything that you see in everyday life that you think there's a science behind it. Tell us what you see in everyday life and take a picture, send it to us. We're going to hold a very exciting science, an exhibition of the top finalist photographs at the National Science Center in Delhi. So, make sure to send in your entries for the same. We have a meme making contest. So if there are any meme making enthusiasts in the audience with us here today, do head over to our website and participate in the same. All of our contests and competitions have very, very exciting prizes. Some have cash prizes, some have Amazon vouchers, and this is a very, very exciting platform for all of you to explore different interests in science communication. So make sure to avail of all of these opportunities. We also have just a minute contest where we'll be giving topics on the go, and you have to speak for 60 seconds. So it's a very exciting jam contest. We also have a drawing contest. So for young kids from aged 3 to 10 years old, you can participate in the drawing contest as well. So make sure to avail of all of these.
Yeah, thanks.
And Dr. Jamil is back.
Yeah.
Right. So can I ask you the next question?
Yes, of course.
All right. So the next question says, is Omicron less harmful? Is it that vaccines are working, or is it that, or are both these statements true? And now, is there a new variant which is a mixture of Omicron and Delta? What are your thoughts about this, and what are we to do with the new variations that are coming forth every single day?
Well, so if you look at the experience of South Africa, where Omicron was first seen, it does cause milder infection. And of course, if you've had a vaccine, even if you get the infection, you're far less likely to get moderate or severe disease. Your disease is likely to be mild. All the discussion that has happened is around how antibodies wane off, and but antibodies protect you from infection. Antibodies don't protect you from disease. T cells protect you from disease, and nobody is really measuring T cells. So the point is that if you're doubly vaccinated, or if you've had an infection and then you got vaccinated, you have hybrid immunity, you are almost certainly going to be protected from severe disease. And also, this virus has mutated. This virus has, 10 mutations in the receptor binding domain. The virus is also paying a fitness cost. So it's not just that you are paying a cost, the virus is also paying a cost. And maybe the cost that it is paying is that its virulence has reduced. But, don't be complacent, because, even a small fraction of a very large number tends to be a large number. So the last thing we want to do is for people to head out to parties and markets and load up hospitals, because mortality happens when the healthcare infrastructure is overloaded. So protect yourself, protect others around you. As far as the other question, a hybrid of Delta and Omicron, that's a WhatsApp imagination. The Delmicron, there's no sequence for a virus called Delmicron in any database. You could be infected by both viruses at the same time, but there is no virus around that is a combination of both. There's another one people have come up with. It's called Flumicron. It's influenza virus combining with Omicron. So yeah, there's nothing like that.
Thank you for busting that myth for us. I mean, that was really helpful. So the next question is a very fun, very important too. So one of our attendees say that they've recently come across the field of virology and are very keen to pursue the field but don't know enough about it. So what exactly does a virologist do?
Talk. Well, how do you study virology? I mean, I would say get a good basic science degree. Virology is not that difficult to learn. you can go do a PhD in virology, you can go do postdoctoral work in virology. I did my undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in chemistry, and I did my PhD in biochemistry, doing enzymology, and then landed up doing virology as a postdoc. So, you have to have an interest in something, and you can learn on your own. In India, there is an MSc program in virology, which is run at the National Institute of Virology. But I really would say that for students, it's important to get good grounding in basic sciences before you diversify and go into these areas.
That's a very interesting takeaway. We have so many students from the STEM sciences, technology, engineering, maths in our audience. So I think that's a very interesting and helpful piece of advice. So one question here is about herd immunity. So is it possible to eliminate the risk of COVID by achieving herd immunity, or is that a myth?
Well, herd immunity firstly doesn't work at the global level or the national level or the regional level. Herd immunity works in clusters. And also, the more infectious a virus becomes, the threshold of herd immunity increases. So if you take measles virus, for example, measles virus has a R0, which is a number that denotes how many people get infected from one infected person. The R0 for measles is 18. And for that somebody to achieve herd immunity, 99% of the population needs to be immune to protect 1%. The COVID virus, at least the new avatars that we have seen, Omicron, for example, is highly infectious. So to think that herd immunity will protect you is not correct. You go get your vaccine. Don't wait for others to get a vaccine so that you can be protected from their herd immunity. It's your duty also to go get vaccinated, because there are people who are not able to take vaccines for medical reasons. So leave the herd immunity to them. If you can take a vaccine and you have vaccines available to you, please go and take them.
All right, Dr. Jamil, the next question here is, do you think there is an end in sight for the pandemic, or is this now that it is a part of our life and that we have to move ahead along with this? This is from a listener who has been following your lectures and talks across the entire pandemic. I'm sure you've been asked this question quite a lot, but once again.
Well, I did touch upon it during my talk today as well. Yes, it will become endemic, but if you ask me whether it will become endemic next year or it will become endemic in 5 years or 10 years, I can't give you the number. It's almost certain that vaccines will have to be updated. It's almost certain that periodic boosters may be needed, especially for people who are vulnerable. But for most of us who have been exposed and vaccinated, you'll be fine.
Dr. Jamil, touching upon a little bit of what Professor Patel also spoke about in his previous session, he spoke about the cultural implications of science communication, and the work that's being done to bridge the gap between science and society. So there's a question here for you. Do you think science reporting needs to improve? What are we doing in terms of improving the gap between science and society? There are so many academicians in the field that are responsible for putting forth bad faith arguments. What is your opinion of the same?
Well, you have all types. The thing is that in the days of social media, everything gets amplified. And often it's very hard to figure out what is right, what is not. I'm sure all of you have your trusted sources. If you believe the corner chaiwala in your locality, you will believe the corner chaiwala in your locality. I can't do anything about it. But what education does is to give you some logic, some reasoning, to be able to sort out what appears to be correct and what appears not to be correct. So I would say look at everything critically. Just because there is a virologist talking, don't take my word for it. Go back and read about it. It's very easy to get things to read these days, good things and bad things. So certainly good communication is important. Fact checking is important. And a lot of this has happened. I mean, I'm sick of seeing in media these days, scientists who don't know one end of a virus from the other, saying Omicron is a natural vaccine, implying, you go get infected with Omicron and you'll be protected from everything, COVID. And that's complete nonsense. We have no idea about what long COVID will do. We have no idea how different population groups will respond to Omicron. So all kinds of things are being said. So I think it's important for good science communication to happen, and events such as this really help. I think we should push for some science media awards or something like that. I had written about this in the Indian Express at one point. The Indian Express has this Ramnath Goenka Awards, and I asked them, how come you don't have an award for science journalism? And they had no answer for it. So maybe, as a community, we should push for something like this.
That brings me into the last question of the session. Really didn't realize how these 45 minutes flew by. But Dr. Jamil, you've been a very active science communicator yourself, and you've been actively, speaking to so many media outlets, engaging with multiple members of the public through the course of the pandemic and even before. What do you think is the role of public engagement platforms such as ISF to bring science and society closer to each other? And do you think scientists and researchers should invest a lot more of their time doing all of this? Or what are your thoughts on the same?
No, absolutely. I think, you do science for two reasons. At least I do science for two reasons. One is to satisfy my curiosity about something. And the second is, if in the process of satisfying my curiosity, I can provide some societal benefit. Now, every scientist every day doesn't have a eureka moment. You don't make fundamental discoveries. If you have a eureka moment once in your lifetime in science, that's very nice. But where you can really help, each one of us can really help, is by engaging with the public and telling them not facts about science, but the process of science. Science is not absolute. Scientists make mistakes. Scientists make a lot of mistakes, but scientists are possibly the only people who love to be corrected for their mistakes. So science is a process. If I say something today and if I say something else tomorrow, it doesn't mean that I was either lying yesterday or I'm lying today. It simply means that technology has improved, knowledge has improved, and therefore I can say something today which is different from what I said yesterday. So that's very important to understand. The scientific process is very important to understand.
So much, Dr. Jamil. On that lovely note, on behalf of the entire team at India Science Festival and Fast India, I thank you for your time. It was an absolute pleasure hosting you at India Science Festival, and we hope that we get to host you in the coming years, possibly in an offline, on-ground model. And it'll be wonderful for us to be able to have a close between you and all of our attendees. We would really love to host you once again. And thank you so much for your time. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you, Shruti. It will be my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jamil.
Bye.
Brings us to the next session at the festival. I'm very, very pleased to invite on stage Professor Richard Wiseman and Shreya Naidu. We have a very, very exciting fireside chat lined up next, and very, very curious to know more about magic, illusions, and the psychology behind it. Professor Wiseman, thank you so much for joining me. It's such a pleasure to host you at IISER. Before we get into the fireside chat, I'd like to take a minute to introduce the interviewer here. Shreya Naidu is joining us from IIT Gandhinagar. She is a junior project fellow at IITG and is handling outreach and public engagement projects at the Curiosity Lab at IIT Gandhinagar. She has conducted multiple large and small scale outreach programs aimed at making neuroscience and behavioral science more accessible. She is also the co-founder of Stimulus, a nonprofit aimed at fostering curiosity in neuroscience and psychology amongst 15 to 28-year-olds. Couldn't have thought of anyone better to conduct this interview. Shreya, over to you. We'll be taking questions from the audience towards the end of this chat, and feel free to all our audience members, feel free to drop in your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll have Professor Wiseman answer all of them towards the end. Over to you both.
Thank you so much, Shruti. It was definitely, it is a pleasure being at India Science Festival virtually and to interact with an amazing psychologist of our time working at the intriguing intersection of magic and human behavior, Professor Richard Wiseman. It's wonderful to have you here, sir.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
On behalf of the IISER team and the audience, I welcome you here. Now to introduce Professor Wiseman to everyone. He is a professor of public understanding of psychology at the University of Hertfordshire. He has written several best-selling books on magic, psychology, luck, and positive action. He introduces people to the simple genius behind magic and illusions through his YouTube channel, Quirkology. Professor Wiseman is also a member of the Inner Magic Circle and a fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. He also acts as a creative consultant and has worked with Darren Brown, the Twilight Zone, and the hit television show Brain Games. He's also given multiple keynote talks to organizations across the world, including the Swiss Economic Forum, Google, and Amazon. So it's wonderful to have you here. Your interest in magic is infectious, and as I delve into it more, I get curious to know more. So with that, let's begin this session and explore the psychology behind magic. So my first question to you, sir, is what intrigued you to study the psychology behind the perception of magic?
Oh, thank you. And thank you for that lovely introduction. It's going to be difficult to live up to that. And welcome. I'm in Scotland, the top of the United Kingdom. And yes, my interest in psychology and magic goes back a very, very long way. So when I was around about 8 years old, I got into magic and quite fascinated by how magicians managed to produce this sense of wonder and incredible phenomena. And when you get into magic, you realize there's a lot of science and psychology there, because in a way, every magic trick is a little experiment, and your experiment has to work. You have to fool people, and they have to see something that's impossible. So if you like, we can try one of those little experiments right now. So doing magic via the internet is a little bit difficult. Let me just pan back a little bit, and hopefully you can see more of me. Here we go. So let me just show you a very, very simple little magic trick. I'm going to tuck this, one of the first tricks I ever learned actually when I was 8 years old. You would tuck the handkerchief into your hand like that, and then give a little blow onto your hand, and then it disappears. So there we are. Very, very simple little magic trick. And when you learn that, you have to figure out how people are thinking and how they're feeling in order to be able to fool them. And I became more and more interested in that side of magic. And that led me to study the psychology of magic and study psychology. So I did a PhD, or an initial degree in magic, an initial degree in psychology, then a PhD on the psychology of deception. And now lots of my research as a professor is looking at the psychology of magic.
Wow, so that magic trick just blew my mind. It's a very simple magic trick, and I have no idea how that happens. There's definitely so much that illusionists have to learn from, from human psyche and behavior of humans. And so I think there's so much that psychologists probably can also explore in this domain, and that's what you're looking at. That's so interesting. So, sir, what do you think that psychologists can learn from illusion artists? Where do these two areas intersect?
It's a very good question. And the answer is there's a lot that magicians can learn from psychologists and psychologists can learn from magicians. So if we look at I've got all these little things to show you here. So let's start off. It's quite difficult to do this. So this isn't a very good magic trick, but this, I'll show it to you because it'll illustrate what I'm talking about. So I hope you can see that. It's a coin, quite a large silver coin here. It's really odd because the angle is very weird on this. But let's imagine you want to take the coin and make it disappear. Okay, very simple little magic trick. What you do is you spend about 2 weeks of your life just dropping the coin like this. And then another 2 weeks taking a coin that's not there, like that. And then you put those two motions, those two movements together, and it looks like you've taken the coin, but actually it's over here. Okay, so there's quite a lot of psychology. That's really simple sleight of hand. It takes about a month to learn it, to do it like this. But there's a lot of psychology. So there's a lot of that psychologists can learn here. So first of all, I need to control your attention. So it's important that I look here because I want you to look at the coin. But when I appear to take the coin, I need to look at this hand so that you look at this hand. Okay. So even in that very simple kind of movement, you're picking up cues from me because we're social animals. We pick up, cues from one another all the time. So you look where I look. The other thing is that we follow moving objects. For good evolutionary reasons. So it's the hand that I want you to look at is the one that moves. You'll see that's the hand that does the big movement. The other hand is just a very small movement here. So already in the most basic piece of sleight of hand, we've discovered about eye movements and attention, and we discovered about movement of hands and attention. And that's just a very simple kind of bit of psychology there. So I think that psychologists have lots to learn from magicians, in part because magicians' experiments, the tricks they perform, have to work every single time in front of every audience. And in most psychology, with experiments, you don't get effects that work for everyone all of the time, where magicians know how to produce those sorts of effects. So I think there's a lot to be learned.
Thank you so much, sir. And it's so amazing that you have so many of these wonderful tricks up your sleeve, quite literally, and to illustrate for the audience what we're really talking about. And so I'm really intrigued to know if we're also, can we also manipulate cognitive aspects? I mean, you did talk about attention, but can we also alter memories? Like there are a lot of magic tricks where someone is probably having a note inside their pocket and they're not aware of it. So there's definitely a lot of cognitive aspects that are being manipulated during magic as well. Could you illustrate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So so before we're talking about attention, obviously perception, very, very cognitive, and magicians manipulate that all the time, but so do optical illusions. So I've brought some of my favorite optical illusions to show you as well. This is 25 minutes of me just getting my toys out to show you all the toys like an 8-year-old child. So you've probably seen this before. It's an illustrator, a sort of model of Einstein, looks great. And when we start to turn it around, at some point, that illusion will break down, and you'll realize that he's actually looking in the opposite direction. So he's, you can see that it's a mask there, and when we turn it around this way, we create this 3D face. And the reason why this works is that most faces aren't concave, they're convex, they come out. And so when we see something that looks a little bit like that, our expectations kick in, and we see something that isn't actually the case. And that is true of a lot of magic. It's, you know, normally when you see somebody do this action, the coin does end up over here. It's because we have expectations. And what magicians are very, very good at doing is taking those assumptions and expectations and exploiting them. 99% of the time, we're amazing because we make these assumptions and they're true. And what magicians do is they exploit the 1% of the time and trip us up. So if you see a chair, you might only be able to see 3 of the legs, but you assume there's a 4th leg. And most of the time there is. And you don't want to spend your whole life checking out every chair to make certain there's a 4th leg. You'd be there all day. But what magicians do is they look at that and go, you can't see the leg though. So what happens if I take it away? How could I use that for a piece of magic? So they're exploiting our assumptions, the assumptions that make us so wonderful. So that's a big part of it. I also brought along the Jastro boomerangs. And again, if anybody knows about science demos, you'll know these. So hopefully the top one looks smaller than the bottom one. And then when I put them the other way around, it's going to go the other way around. So it's a nice little demonstration there. Again, fooling our perception. So we've spoken about attention, we've spoken about perception, and you touched on another really important point, which is memory. Because when you see a magic trick, you don't have to be just fooled then. When you think about the trick afterwards, you need to be fooled as well. And all your friends are going to get together and you're all going to share the memory and say, well, I thought it was this and I thought it was that. And so what magicians do is they trip up memories as well. It means that when you come to remember the trick, often you can't remember the important details. Now, why is that the case? And it's because magicians are creating a fake narrative. And what appears to be important in the fake narrative is what you'll remember, because we remember important stuff. And what's really important in the real narrative, we'll forget. So for example, we'll go back to my little coin here. If we're going to take this, what's important? Well, the important thing is I take the coin, I blow, and it disappears. And so often that's what people remember. He blew on his hand and the coin disappeared. The bit they'll forget in the real narrative is that he transferred the coin from one hand to the other. That's not important. And so what you'll remember is this wonderful moment of, and it disappearing. And you'll forget the really important bit just before that. So magicians know how to manipulate memories as well. You're absolutely right.
Wow, sir, that is amazing. And to think about the theatrics that is involved in all of this, there's definitely another intersection that's going there in drama and magic. So I was wondering probably about your perspective towards magic. You are, you can say, behind the curtain and you know exactly what's happening and you're exploring this. So from your perspective, have you started looking at it, magic, from an objective lens, perhaps? Has it probably lost its magical charm?
No, magic evolves all of the time. And so magicians write up their magical experiments, their tricks, in journals like scientists, in books like scientists, and that literature goes back 100, 150 years. It's huge. And magicians are always coming up with new ideas. It's constantly fascinating. And a lot of it builds, like science, on the work of previous people. And so if I take a very, very simple, now I hope you can see this. Let me use a different colored band. It might be a little bit better. Let me zoom up on this one. The magic of the internet. There we go. So I hope you can see the band is around my top 2 fingers. And we're just going to give it a little a little shake. And now it's around the bottom 2. Okay. Let me just do that again because it wasn't the smoothest of ones. Top ones. And now it's bottom ones. That little illusion, and if you want to perform it, you put the band on your first two fingers here. As you close your hand, you pull the band across, you put in all your fingers into the band, and now when you open your hand, it will jump to the other two fingers. And so that's how it looks like from the back. You put all your fingers in and it jumps. But what we're doing from the front is all the fingers are in there. I move my hand up and down to hide that little jump. Now, that was invented in 1911. Okay, so whatever that is, 110 years ago. And around about 30 years after that was invented, somebody realized you could take another band and put it around your fingers like that, and still the band would jump. So you can make it jump back again. And the reason for that is lateral thinking. All the band is doing is that. It doesn't matter whether the fingers are sort of masked off like that. So this is why magic is endlessly fascinating. You know, people are inventing things nowadays that no one's ever thought of, you know, for 120, 200, 100 years. So magic never gets boring. It's a great thing to be into. It always feeds your curiosity.
Oh, that is exactly what I'm also working on, sir. So I work at the Curiosity Lab, and magic is definitely such a fascinating thing. There's so much unknown about it. And I mean, that really brings me to a question. Why do people get so attracted to the unknown? Why do they seek the unknown? And also, being part of the Curiosity Lab, I understand that there is an innate desire to know something that you don't know, and there are some evolutionary processes along with it that are beneficial, that support this process of seeking the unknown. And we try to use educational kind of ways to inculcate this feeling of pursuing the unknown to improve learning in schools. But do you think magic could also come in there, perhaps in educational ways and therapeutic ways even?
Oh, yeah. So lots of my research has looked at magic and well-being. I mean, when you learn a very simple magic trick, you just think what you're doing. You're learning focus, you're learning practice, you're showing it to other people. So there's social skills. There's lateral thinking because you're having to think of different methods. There's digital manipulation, all these things. Some of my work has looked at it within an educational context, and it's exactly what you say. It increases engagement because it's not only that people are seeing something that they don't understand, they're seeing something that's impossible, and it appears to be happening right in front of their eyes. And it's very hard to see something that's impossible and not be curious. And so we've created educational videos, science videos, where you put magic in and people become more engaged with the videos. In other work, we've gone out to schools and taught children magic tricks, and they become more creative thinkers. When you give them measures of creative thinking, they perform higher afterwards than before. So I think it has all of these possibilities. And it's exactly what you say, that we have brains that are anticipating the future. That's kind of how our brains work to some extent. And so when something surprising happens, that's a very important piece of information because our model about the world was now wrong. So we become curious and we start to explore. And what magic does is take that idea and make it huge, because it's not that this thing is just surprising, it's impossible. You know, and so I keep coming back to my little coin here. You know, we know coins are solid objects. We all handle coins. We know that you can't take a coin, blow on it, and make it so small you can't see it. That's impossible. And so I think it takes that feeling we have about curiosity in the unknown and makes it really, really big. And it also allows us to dream. You know, good science is about dreaming about impossibilities and then seeing whether you can make them come true or not. And so being able to dream of these impossible things, the idea of getting to the moon, putting a person on the moon, yeah, that seems like a crazy thought, but we did it with science and technology. It's that same ability to imagine the impossible.
That is just completely brilliant. I did not think that I could think of magic in such a scientific way. And now that I think about it, it is such a scientific process. By thinking about the previous work that people have done, by kind of defining your experiment, by also trying to play it out and see if it really works. I think I want to take out some time to delve into the new book of yours that is coming, Hocus Pocus, bringing skepticism to new. I'm so sorry. It was regarding the history of magic. I'm so sorry. I mixed up your work, sir. You have so many amazing works that I just mixed that up. So I wanted to actually talk about history of magic, the book that that is going to come out. And since you've talked about previous literature that you magicians also rely on, so maybe if you could just give us a little introduction about what that is going to be about.
Well, it's another reason why magic is so fascinating. It really does preserve its history like science. And so David Copperfield, the legendary illusionist, he performs every night in Vegas, and he's an incredible magician. He's also created a secret museum of magic. And this thing is huge, and it's in Las Vegas. And I was lucky enough to be shown around it. And I said to David, why don't we do a book about the history of magic based on the museum? So the new book is all about that. It's called David Copperfield's History of Magic. And it takes readers through the museum and talking about the history of magic. And there's, again, a lot in there about science and magic. So one of my favorite stories is about Houdini. Now, you may not remember, we won't remember Houdini, but you may not have heard of Houdini. He's this amazing escape artist from the sort of turn of the last century. And so they'd lock him up in straitjackets or cells, prison cells, and he'd always escape. And he was legendary. And so one day he comes to Scotland, actually, where I am at the moment, and they lock him up in a prison cell. And he can't pick the lock. He's trying and he's trying, and he's there for a couple of hours, and he can't pick the lock. He can't get out of the cell. And he just can't understand why he can't do it. And then he leans on the cell door, and it just swings open because it's never been locked. So he's trying to pick a lock which has never been closed. And so as he says afterwards, what was trapping him in the cell was his own assumptions about the world. In the same way that magicians trap you in their world, he got trapped by his own assumptions. And I think it's a very good lesson to all of us that no matter how smart we are, and no matter how much we know, we're making assumptions and we can trip ourselves up. And so the book has those stories in it, celebrates the history of magic.
So all of these stories, I feel like they are so motivating. There's so many takeaways, and it's not just about the magic. It's also kind of what you feel about kind of the motivation that you get to pursue more and kind of just broaden your thinking. And that I also want to bring up Hocus Pocus, bringing skepticism to new audiences via comics, because it's such an interesting piece of work. And I think it's also great for children to kind of, and I also think that it could be a very good science communication tool. So could you also delve into that a little bit?
I can. I wish I had an issue to show you, actually. It's a comic. We decided I worked with Jordan Culver and Rick Worth, and they produced comics, science comics. And I said, how about we do one about skepticism and the paranormal and magic? And it's called Hocus Pocus, and you can look at the website. And it takes people through skeptical thinking in this very kind of engaging way, and it's interactive and so on. There's little magic tricks in there. And we've done some experiments, some science communication experiments with it. And again, people find it a very engaging way, in part actually because I'm dyslexic. And so I much prefer pictures to words. So when I saw their wonderful work, I was very, very engaged with it. And the other thing about magic, we should say, is that what I find incredible is that you can really get into magic. You can become the greatest magician in the world for almost no cost. You know, a pack of cards that doesn't cost very much, or a coin, or some rubber bands. It's why it's a great kind of teaching tool, because these are very inexpensive objects. And also what you're showing people is the potential. This isn't just a coin, it's something that you can make disappear, and you can give people a wonderful experience. You can take something that's very ordinary and make it extraordinary. And when you're talking about those take-home lessons, I think that's another really important take-home lesson. There's magic in that sense in all of us.
So that is extremely touching. And I mean, being probably someone who was also fascinated by magic as a child, and then probably growing up and kind of realizing that magic is all just about tricks. I do want to ask, do you believe that magic as a naturally occurring phenomenon could really exist? Can we all believe in a Cinderella dream or like a Disney dream happening? What do you think about it?
Well, what magicians do, they do show you a trick, but what they're really giving you is a magical experience. So it isn't about the fact I don't transfer the coin. What I really care about is seeing your face when I take something, blow, and that's the magical experience of making it disappear. We're showing people what might be. And we're getting them to open their minds to other possibilities. And that's great. What we shouldn't do is tell them that there's real magic, in that this is really magic. It's not. It's a trick. It's psychology. What I think is really magical, though, is when you open people's minds to those possibilities and they create those things for real, whether they create them through working hard in their own lives, or whether they use science, or whether they use technology, that you kind of awaken a dream because they see something in front of them that they can't explain. And it's not like going to a film or reading a book where you know it's a simulation. Magic is real in the sense of it happens right in front of you, and it seems to actually occur. But it can awaken people's dreams, I think, to what might be, and then they can figure out ways of making those dreams actually happen.
Wow, sir. So, I mean, I did look into some of your work on positive action, and I really did find that very interesting because what you're talking about magic happening when people just open their minds to certain possibilities. A lot of your work is so associated with motivation, positive action. Could you also go a little bit into how you even developed the concept of positive action and how magic is associated with it, and how it's probably helped and impacted many people across the globe?
Yeah, so the other part of my work we haven't spoken about at all is on how you get people to do that second part, how you get them to be into a better place, more successful or happier or whatever it is. And that started about 20 years ago. I wrote a book called The Luck Factor about how to be lucky, and how if you're optimistic, it made you attracted kind of people towards you. You kept going when the going got tough, and so on. And then I did another book about, as you say, positive action, which is the way in which your actions affect how you think and behave. So commonly, our understanding of the mind is the way you think, your emotions you feel affect your behavior. So if you feel happy, you smile. That's true, but the opposite is also true. If you force your face into a smile, and people who are watching this can try it now, you'll feel happier. And so it's about how psychology and science can be used to change lives, to improve lives. So I think there's an overlap with the magic. It's quite different in some ways, but there's an overlap there. It's always about what might be and how you create a better future for yourself and others.
Thank you so much, sir. So I do want to know, to all, even the young audiences and the curious audiences who are here, what would you like to say to them about probably incorporating, or even if they're interested to explore magic, where could they begin, and why should they even explore and get into magic? And also, maybe if while you're answering that, could you also talk about how the awareness of how magic can help in motivating and improving people's imagination, and even in science comm, that is important, and how probably platforms like ISF are they helping in any way achieving this goal?
I'm sure they are. I mean, I think this overlaps with some of what you're talking about with your previous speaker, who was absolutely fascinating. We need people to understand psychology and science and technology, and that's the world they're living in. And if they don't understand it, we can run into all sorts of problems, as we're seeing to some extent in the world today. So those people that are curious about science and technology probably don't need very much motivation to get into it. However, there's a lot of people that aren't curious about it at all. And how do you get them to share the love and enthusiasm that we have for this topic? And of course, one way is that you can look at something they are interested in and explore the science of it. It doesn't have to be magic. You can look at the science of music. You can look at the science of dance. You can look at the science of drama, anything, art, anything they're interested in, there will be a scientific component. I think magic is particularly interesting because you can stand in front of a group of people at a science center or a classroom or whatever it is and do something incredible. Most magic is fairly straightforward, and people will lean forward and they'll want to know how you did what you did, and so you've got their attention. And that's the first part of any kind of communication. And in teaching them these very simple tricks, you're teaching them a whole range of skills, and you're getting them to think creatively and, more importantly, critically. And also, when you come to learn magic, you'll make horrible mistakes. I mean, it's one thing for me, to sit here and just go, oh, you put the elastic band on and then it jumps. Well, I've been doing this for, 40 years or something. When you first try it, you'll be all over the place and the band will flick off and you don't know what's happening. So you learn that actually to learn magic, you need to focus and make mistakes and learn from them. And these are all great learning lessons in terms of science and technology. So if people are in that position at a science center or a school or going out and giving talks, I think it's a really good thing. And it's very easy. There's loads of beginners books on magic, which are out there. So I think that would be my answer. The second part of the question, what was the second part? Just remind me.
Right. I wanted to know if platforms like ISF are also helping contribute to this understanding and kind of connecting science communicators to probably encourage the incorporation of such diverse and different ideas to promote science communication.
I hope that they are. I mean, when lots of people, so when I tried to learn a different language at school, I found it incredibly difficult. And so when you talk to me about learning French, which is what we were taught at school, my memories are just of agony of sitting in this class, not being able to do this thing. But that's a very good learning lesson, because that's how many people feel about maths and many people feel about science. I didn't have those problems. I got maths and science straight away. But many people, it's just a miserable experience. And so when you talk about science and maths, you go, oh my goodness, that was like being at school. It was terrible. So what can you do to bring those people on board and give them a good time to replace those negative memories with something more positive? And I think that's what good science communication is about. It has to touch emotion as much as it touches information. And so, platforms, like the Science Festival and so on, if they can do that, if they can make people smile and laugh and have a good time when they're finding out about science, it will kind of get them to be thinking, oh, actually, science isn't this terrible thing that you get wrong all the time. It's a kind of fun thing.
I hope the science communicators in the audience are taking notes. That was a wonderful remarks. So I think that was definitely, with the tricks and your perspectives, I was blown away. Thank you so much for those wonderful comments. I think it's time we can take some questions from the audience as well. So we have an attendee who is asking about magic and health. You did mention that. So maybe you could elaborate on the relationship between magic and health.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I have a paper out there on a platform called PeerJ, which is all about magic and well-being. And so magic has been used in various ways. If people have motor coordination problems, often they have to perform the same action again and again. and it becomes a very boring task. But if you can incorporate magic into that, it becomes a meaningful task. And so that can help in terms of health. Also, in terms of a healthy lifestyle, connecting with others is extremely important, because then you have people to talk to, and so they can insulate you when things go wrong and help you and so on. And magic does connect you with other people. You've got something to show them at the party or talk about or whatever. So we know that that's another pathway. There's also been a lot of work with magic in hospitals carried out all over the world, where children often are very anxious, obviously, about being in hospital, and showing them a magic trick can lower that anxiety, but also they have something to show the other people in the hospital again. And so all this work, I think magic is quite unique in that, because you can learn a magic trick very, very quickly. You can show it one-to-one. It's fairly quiet activity. It's not like giving somebody a drum in a hospital and saying, here's how you beat the drum, which you probably don't want, or even sing a song or even dance. I think it's quite unique in that it's often a quiet thing done between two people that requires practice. And so as a performing art, I think it's very helpful in those sorts of contexts.
Thank you so much, sir. That was a very interesting point regarding using it in hospitals as well. I have personally known about clown therapy, and magic almost seems to be on a very similar spectrum, but at the same time, the uniqueness of it being so intimate is definitely very interesting and to be considered. So I do want to ask, in a lot of sense, or rather one of the attendees asks, we've been kind of picking out from behavioral therapies, from behavioral concepts in psychology about what magicians are doing. But has it ever happened the other way around? Or is it possible that the psychologists discover something new about aspects of human psychology from what magicians are doing?
Oh, psychologists will. Psychologists have done, because magicians are out there doing these experiments all the time. And so absolutely. I thought you were about to ask the other way around, which is, have magicians learned from science and technology? And to some extent they have. Some magic tricks involve science. If you look, there's a YouTube video I made a very long time ago called the color changing card trick, and that relies on a psychological principle. So I think there's been some learnings from science and psychology to magicians, but most of the activity is the other way around. It's scientists learning from magicians. You know, we shouldn't forget, you know, a lot of very early on, science and magic were in the same kind of demonstrations and lectures. You know, that it would be a very theatrical public demonstration of magic tricks and then science experiments. The two weren't separated. And it still happens in chemistry. You know, chemistry people often do demonstrations if they're magical and so on. So this has a very long history. Yeah, it's a good question.
Oh, yes, that also reminds me of, I think a lot of Indian children would have done this. When we were learning chemistry early on, we were asked to put turmeric on a paper and then put soap. And that would create a red dye, or rather red pattern. And that was the first probably magic trick we saw, even including writing with lemon on a piece of paper, and that would be invisible ink. So that
Oh, it's great. It's great. I mean, one of the first things I brought out here, the balancing bird, which is just brilliant. So this is it goes on the little tip of the pen here. I hope you can see it. I'm going to take it right up here and give it a little tap, and just balances on the tip of the pen. So magicians they don't use this because lots of people know about this. I mean, you can buy it now in lots of shops. I can't get it right at the end. There we go. But the question is, how would magicians use that? So you think, well, let's imagine the bird is a person, and let's imagine you want to levitate the person on stage. The obvious thing to do is put all wires and strings and things coming up here. But if you use this technique, you only need one support of some sort, and that person will be levitated on stage. That's the secret of a lot of magic levitations. And so it's exactly the same principle, but used in just a way that affords you. Because, you know, normal people, as it were, would think that you need lots of points to balance the bird. In fact, it turns out there's only one. So again, you'd think, well, how would you apply that to a person? How would you get to that situation where the center of gravity is way off with a person? And that's what magicians love to think about. So there's a little task there for you more engineering oriented folks.
It's actually very interesting because the Center for Creative Learning at IIT Gandhinagar has recently made the exact same thing, and they're using it to teach children science. So there's definitely so much potential out there for such magic tricks. So we have a question regarding probably your roots, and if you were a professional magician before you started studying psychology, or was it vice versa? How did this transition happen?
I worked as a professional magician. So I got into magic when I was about 8 years old. My very first magic show when I was 9 years old, and then I was performing magic all the way through until I was about 19 years old. And I was doing a lot of magic on the streets. It's quite a good place to learn stuff, actually. So I was doing that. I went to America for a little bit. And then I got so fascinated with psychology that I decided to switch and do a psychology degree. And at the time, my initial qualifications were in maths and physics and chemistry. And so the obvious thing to do was to go into one of those three areas. But I was just fascinated by people because of the magic. And so I went into psychology. And what's great about psychology is that you can study anything you find fascinating. So if you're into dance, you can look at the psychology of dance. If you're into whatever it is, home decorating, you can look at the psychology of home decorating. It's hard to do that so much with physics and chemistry. So I think if you've got a passion, if there's a fire that's burning inside you, then if you can figure out a way of making a living out of that passion, you probably have got the equation for happiness right there. And then if you want to find out what your passion is, I always say to people, imagine you're stranded on an island in the middle of nowhere and you're allowed one stack of books. What are those books going to be about? For me, it'd be a stack of magic books. But what would it be for other people? That's probably the quickest way of finding out what your passion is.
Wow, I'm going to do this exercise today. I think I really need to revisit and see where my passions lie. And I think that's a great exercise to even kind of direct yourself in whichever way you want to go. Thank you so much, sir. So when we're talking about what you want to do in future or kind of the direction you want to take, children are generally the ones who have the most brilliant, extraordinary thoughts about what they're going to be when they grow up. And maybe something that I would want to, or one of the audiences would like to know is that can younger children learn magic easier? So is it something that elders like me, if I want to try out a magic trick and probably switch into being a magician, would that be harder for me, or is it easier for younger children?
It's a very good question. It's an odd thing. Most magicians have got into magic by the time they're 8 or 9 years old. There must be some psychology behind it, but almost all of us, I mean, all of my friends, magicians, and we're all in the same generation. We all learnt it when we're 8, 9 sort of years old. However, anyone obviously can learn to do magic, and if you learn to love it, that will just come out of. You just communicate it in the same way as if you love science or you love engineering, somehow the audience pick up on that. They pick up on the authenticity. There is nothing worse than seeing a speaker telling you they love something when they clearly don't. And you just feel part of you dying. And that gets back to that passion thing. The other thing which we haven't touched upon, but just briefly mention, the other thing that's great about magic is that with cardboard, you create bits of magic. I mean, you've got the sort of 2 bits of thing here, this one. It's great for maker skills. It's really good for making stuff. I'm 55 years old. I still sit upstairs at evenings cutting up bits of cardboard, gluing them into boxes and thinking, oh, that's quite good. So it encourages maker skills as well, and I think that's great in terms of science and exploration.
So, sir, what do you think? How long do you think it would take an amateur to learn a magic trick on average? I'm assuming it also depends on the magic trick, but what would you like to say?
Oh, it's really difficult. I mean, you can learn this thing in whatever that is, 5 minutes. It will take you an hour of practicing probably to get it smooth enough that you're happy to do it in front of people. And then it will take you a lifetime to how to figure out how to present this so that it's not just a puzzle. So you might say, oh, somebody gave me this magic band the other day, and I paid quite a lot of money for this band because they told me it could do something incredible. They told me it could jump from some fingers to the other. My goodness, they're right. It actually jumped. So you make up a little story, or you get someone to blow on the magic band as it jumps. So it isn't about you. You know, I think there's a difference between showing off, which is about you, and performing, which is about the audience. And as good science communicators, we should be performing, always thinking, are they enjoying it? Are they getting it? Not, am I just looking like I'm really intelligent or whatever it is?
Thank you so much, sir. So I just, like one of the audiences wanted to know, in your experience, how do different societies and cultures perceive magic? Does it vary greatly? So, I mean, it would have been so amazing if you would have come to India and you would have probably also experienced the cultural difference. But what do you think in your experience?
Well, I did go to India many, many years ago, about 20 years ago. I had a wonderful time, and India's got some incredible magicians. While I was there, I was looking at the Indian street magicians, who, my goodness, just the ability to captivate a crowd and hold them is astonishing. It's astonishing. And they have a little trick called the diving duck, which is a little plastic duck or a wooden duck that's placed on water, and it dives under the water and comes back up again. And I must have watched that, I don't know, probably 10, 12 hours. I was watching I was following these performers around. I couldn't figure out how they were doing this. It's a really old piece of Indian street magic, so it's wonderful. So every culture has entertainment magic, and that's what I'm interested in. Now, of course, cultures vary massively on whether they believe in, quotes, real magic. And often people mingle those two together. And actually, I think they should be kept apart. But you know, every culture, to my understanding, has entertainment magic. It has somebody doing something that makes you smile and laugh and appears impossible. But of course, it varies. And that's what's lovely about it. Japanese magic, for example, often extremely intricate, extremely optical. And so this is a piece that, again, some people will say, oh, this works good. So this is the, I can't see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cubes. And when we turn it around here, it goes to 6, I think. So invented by a wonderful Japanese professor, Sugihara. And that's very kind of a Japanese approach, very clever, very optical, very smart. And so, yeah, each culture has its own way of doing entertainment magic, which is wonderful.
Thank you so much. So that was wonderful illusion. And you demystified it for us by just showing us how the optical illusion works. And you demystified so many different magic tricks. So I am a little curious to think that, do you think magicians might feel a little insecure about demystifying magic?
No, there's magic you can tell people about, and there's magic you shouldn't tell people about. And so I had a YouTube channel called Quirkology, which has got loads and loads of magic and stunts and all these sorts of things on. And there's hundreds of them there. And I never had one complaint from one magician ever. So there's a kind of line in the sand where it's fine for me to tell you about rubber bands or about the coin trick, because magicians can still fool you and will fool you. It doesn't really give away their proper secrets. And that's what's interesting about magic. It has held on to its secrets for a very, very long time. And the reason for that is when you find out how most magic tricks are done, it's a disappointment. You know, it's a thread or a mirror or something. And you expected this complicated, wonderful thing, and it isn't. The wonderful experience is watching magic. And that's why magicians don't tell you how tricks are done. So you have that sense of wonder.
Thank you so much, sir. So talking about different magicians, even over time, I'm curious to know if there are any different sort of paradigms and if there are any shift in paradigms. So one of the audience members is asking, like the shift from Newtonian to Einsteinian physics, similar to that, are there any shifts in paradigms for magic?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And yes, there are. So most, and it's to do with performing circumstances. So most magicians started out, say about 18, well, not, if you start in the 1800s, you've got magic on the street. They're going from fairs to fairs. They're street magicians, which means you've probably got a little table and some props. And then around about 1840, you start to get theatres in the UK and other places in the world, and magic moves into those theatres. Now it becomes stage magic. And at some point, they start playing around with mirrors. And mirrors are a nightmare on stage because the reflections go everywhere. But they realize that if you put a mirror into a box, you've created your own little mini stage in the box. And that gives rise to all these illusions you see where people get in and out of boxes. And so that all happens. And that carries on for a long time. And then you get cinema coming along. So people aren't going to those stage shows so much. And so you get much more sort of cabaret parlor type magic. And then today there's been a shift into what's called street magic. It's something like David Blaine, who's going out into the streets and performing, going back to the roots. And particularly what's called close-up magic, which is magic performed just a few feet away. So each kind of generation of magicians is often working in a slightly different paradigm, in the same way that paradigms within science and technology change as well.
Yes, sir. And there's also this kind of, maybe I would like to call it a thin line difference between science and in psychology and a subject called parapsychology, where we have so many different overlapping concepts, but at the same time, there is a difference, or rather psychologists and scientists are trying to create a difference between what is science and what is probably not. A very interesting concept that always comes up is hypnotism. And one of the audience member wants to know what it's about and is it related to magic?
Oh, it's a good question. So hypnotism is a tricky one. Within psychology, there are two approaches. One is that it is a trance state, that you're in a different state of consciousness. The other is that you're essentially sort of playing a role. And so it's a bit like if you dress somebody up as a police person, they start to play the role of a police person. And so hypnosis is a bit like that. They know how they should act and they start to unconsciously act like that. And the argument, as I understand it, is that when it comes to therapy, it might be a little bit more like the trance one. When it comes to stage hypnotism, where you get lots of people on stage and they all start running around like chickens or whatever it is they're doing, that's closer to role play. Does magic use hypnotism? Not directly in the way you'd understand it, but it does use language very, very carefully. And language is key to hypnotism. It does put suggestions into people's minds. So if I've got a deck of cards here. Oh, it doesn't matter. If I had a deck of cards, if I say choose a card, and I'm trying to make you choose a certain card and influence your behavior, and I say choose a card, you're really hard to influence because I've just put so much attention on choose that you'll go, I have that one. Oh no, I have this one. If I say, oh, just hold on to one of these cards for me, it plays down the choice and it's really easy to persuade you to choose a particular card as you take it out the deck. And it's very similar to hypnotism. You're influencing people by the words you're using, or you're getting them to play a certain role by the role that you're putting them in. So yes, there is an overlap there, but the psychology of hypnotism is fascinating. And there's been some brain scanning studies now looking at hypnotism as well. But yes, so there's an overlap, but it's quite a small overlap.
Thank you so much, sir. And this was an amazing 1 hour is gone by, and I haven't really noticed. It was a brilliant conversation with you, sir. I think I want to end with one nice takeaway, probably, that you would like to share with the budding magicians, with the psychologists out there, the science communication people who are watching you. What would you just like to have one takeaway message for them?
I think I go back to what I was saying about passion. Is the reason I think, you know, I've done what I've done is that I'm passionate about magic. I will spend my evenings reading about it and watching magic shows. And because of that, I know a lot about it. And each and every one of you will have a passion. It probably won't be magic. It might be something else. But if you pursue that, if you incorporate it into what it is you're doing, you'll spend longer than other people doing that because you're passionate, and you'll probably become better than them. And it's a pretty good recipe, as I say, for happiness. So follow your passion. And also, I hope the session today, and thank you very much for hosting it. Lovely questions. So thank you very much. And thank you to the festival for inviting me. I hope what we've done is opened people's eyes. Magic can be a great, great tool for science communication. It's not difficult. Get out there, use it, and most of all, play and have fun.
Thank you so much, sir. That was a wonderful ending to this wonderful talk that I just wish I could just continue on with, and also see so many of different magic tricks. And I'm definitely going to go and look at some of your videos on Quirkology on YouTube, because I just really want to know more about this topic right now. Thank you so much, sir, for a wonderful evening. And with that, I would like to invite Shruti to take over.
So much, Shreya, for conducting a wonderful interview, and Professor Wiseman, on behalf of the entire team at India Science Festival and Past India, I thank you for all of your time. It was such an enthralling session, and I must say that all of us backstage moderators quite literally stopped breathing for a few seconds because we realized that you're doing a magic trick live for us. We really didn't know that this was going to happen. It was such a pleasant surprise. All of our audience members have been really, it was a very fascinating session, and I'm so glad that we got the opportunity to have you at this festival where you could really quite literally demystify the science behind what's going on in magic and illusions. And like you mentioned, here's hoping that this platform and this 1 hour session has just opened the minds of all our attendees to the possibilities that magic, illusions, and psychology can offer. And thank you so much for your time. Here's hoping that we get to host you for the next time, quite literally in India, in an offline setting on ground, where you get to do live magic in front of all of our attendees and engage with them on a very close, upfront, personal level. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed the session too.
I absolutely did. Thank you very much. And yes, hopefully it'll be face-to-face next time. We'll do even more magic.
Thank you so much, Professor and Shreya. Thank you. Couldn't have asked for anyone better to conduct this interview for us. It's been a pleasure hosting you too. Thank you so much. And with that, I'd like to thank all of our attendees for sticking by for the third session on day 3 of India Science Festival. It's been a pleasure to have all of you with us in the webinar room. And thank you so much for sticking by. Of course, this is the last concluding address. We are going to have a bunch of really exciting talks, panel discussions, workshops, competitions, and contests in the coming days. The festival is running till the 23rd of January, and we have a plethora of events lined up for everyone. There's something to do for everybody at this festival. I'd just like to tell you a little about our contests. They're absolutely free to register. There are some very exciting prizes for everyone. We have Amazon vouchers, we have some cash prizes, and we'll be giving certificates to the participants of our contest. So make sure to register and participate. All of our sessions are absolutely free to attend. All you need to do is head over to our website, pick the event that you're interested in attending, and add it to give us your details, and we'll make sure to send you reminders of the same. I'd also like to very quickly tell you about the kind of book talks that we have at the festival. We're covering some very exciting topics like the science of science, the science behind Indian cooking. We're going to explore India's adventures in space. We're going to look at entrepreneurs in the space of deep tech. We're looking at research and how we need to rethink the nature and nurture of research. So all of these book talks and a lot more only at India Science Festival 2022. Catch the action live on all of our social media handles. We'll be dropping a link in the chat. We're live on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and all of our sessions are recorded. They can be found on YouTube. Make sure to engage with us. Take a screen grab of all the events that you attend. Tell us what you like, tell us what you don't like, and we'll make sure to incorporate your feedback to improve our events in the future. There's a feedback form that we'll be dropping in the chat right now. Please do tell us what you think of our sessions, and we're happy to improve and make this experience more enjoyable for all of you. I would also like to tell you a little about the kind of workshops that we have for kids. Make sure to tell the children in your family about the workshops at India Science Festival. We have one session on microbes, one hands-on session on brain. Kids get to design a brain using clay. They get to see some very nice photographs and paintings of the brain. So all of this and more only at India Science Festival. I'll see you tomorrow. We have 3 very, very exciting events lined up. We'll be talking about the neuroscience of misinformation. We'll be talking about biorobots and how insects have inspired the making of robots. And we'll be talking about quantum computing and how it's evolved over the years and what's the future for quantum computing in India. All of these talks only at India Science Festival. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great evening.